Somos Investing Bogotá, la agencia de promoción de inversión de la ciudad, una iniciativa público-privada entre la Alcaldía Mayor y la Cámara de Comercio de Bogotá. Esto es Bogotá Big Ideas Academy, un espacio de formación en el que junto con expertos locales y extranjeros buscamos generar contenido que aporte al crecimiento académico de emprendedores y empresarios. Estaremos hablando sobre emprendimiento, negocios, economía, inversión y mucho más, siempre con el propósito de impulsar el talento que se proyecta al mundo desde Bogotá. Bienvenidos a Bogotá Big Ideas Academy.
Buenas tardes, gracias por acompañarnos hoy. Bienvenidos al programa de actualización para profesionales del sector audiovisual. Esto es organizado por ASOCINDE, la Asociación Colombiana de Productores Independientes del Cine y el Audiovisual, y el Latin American Training Center, que es un centro de formación para profesionales del mundo audiovisual en Latinoamérica. Esto es con el apoyo de Investing Bogotá, la agencia de promoción de inversión para Bogotá. Esto es una iniciativa que busca profundizar acerca de algunos cargos y campos que constituyen un mayor reto en la industria colombiana. Esta es la 7ª clase de 10. Mi nombre es Andrés Velázquez, soy diseñador de sonido y re-recording mixer con más de 15 años de experiencia en el sector. Después de vivir en Los Ángeles durante varios años y cofundar la empresa 1000 Birds, me mudé el año pasado aquí a Bogotá para abrir el estudio aquí en el país, desde donde hemos estado haciendo varias películas y series y comerciales, entre las cuales tenemos 3 que este año estamos presentando en el Festival de Tribeca la semana entrante, y entre las que está una película llamada Shithouse, que ganó el premio narrativo en el Festival de South by Southwest del año pasado. O sea, acá estamos en Bogotá a la orden para lo que necesiten. También les quiero introducir a nuestro speaker de hoy. Se llama Nierenberg. Él ha sido editor, diseñador y supervisor de sonido en Nueva York y Los Ángeles durante más de 35 años y tiene más de 150 créditos en cine y televisión. Jay ha trabajado en películas como The Fugitive, Clear and Pleasant Danger, Batman Forever, además de formar parte de un equipo de edición de sonido nominado al Oscar en cada uno de sus primeros 4 años en Los Ángeles. Recientemente ha trabajado como diseñador de sonido y re-recording mixer en la premiada serie documental de HBO, The Defiant Ones, y ha dirigido el sonido del drama de acción de NBC, The Brave, y la serie de televisión de Paramount, Paradise Lost. En la actualidad, Jay supervisa y diseña el sonido de la emblemática serie de fantasía de Amazon, Carnival Row, así como de la serie Dinastía para CBS y Netflix. Entonces, esta charla va a ser en inglés. Jay, I want to invite you to join us and to get started. Les cuento que las preguntas las pueden hacer en español y yo pues puedo ayudar aquí a hacer la traducción. Entonces, Jay, thank you for joining us. Welcome. And
my pleasure. Thank you.
Excited to hear what you have to say, what you have to tell us and teach us.
Don't get too excited. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. Sorry, it's all going to be in English. Hope that's okay with everybody. My good friend Andres, so we'll translate as needed, I guess. I think from the introduction, you've got a decent idea of what I do and what I've been up to. I guess I'll do a little further detailed introduction of myself and my history. I actually got started in the film industry in 1986 on a tiny little movie called The Suicide Club, starring Mariel Hemingway and Robert Joy. It was purely by chance. I happened to be a journalism major at NYU driving a cab and picked up the assistant picture editor who was getting dailies from a bus that was coming in from the Hamptons out in Long Island in New York, and took her to DuArt Labs uptown, and we had a very long ride and a long conversation, and next thing I know, she was inviting me to be an apprentice in the editing room with her. And for some reason that I'm not sure of, I took her up on it. And before I knew it, I had a career in film and post-production. Specifically, I was hired as an assistant sound editor for the sound portion of that film. because one of the sound editor's assistants dropped out at the last minute, and apparently he had no better choices. And so I did that and started soaking in everything that I could about sound. This was 1987. We were all back on, we were on film back then, completely on film. There was no digital audio workstations yet, no Pro Tools, and learned how to cut sound on film. I started getting some bigger and better jobs, joined the union in New York, worked on a couple of Mike Nichols movies, Postcards from the Edge and Regarding Henry, and a couple of other big films, Far and Away, Tom Cruise. And I moved out to Los Angeles in '92, actually to be an actor, not to continue my sound editing career, but my sound editing career continued nonetheless. My wife was an actress. I came out with her, and I just kept working. You know, I within the first year, I found myself working on a little film called Under Siege, which was nominated for an Oscar for sound, and then The Fugitive, and then Clear and Present Danger, and then the Batman movies, as Andres said in the introduction. So I just kept going, and I worked for a few years in the commercial industry for a company called Elias Arts, one of the bigger music composition companies in Los Angeles and around the globe. Did that for about 4 years, got back into film, started my own little company called Sublime Sound, and bounced around, worked at all the major studios. Now, currently, I'm working at a company called Formosa Group, which is one of the bigger independent sound companies. Although I don't know how independent and small we are anymore. We just bought up Technicolor Sound, part of a bigger umbrella company, I think called Livestream, which also owns Picturehead, another huge media company. So it's yeah, we have a lot of fun stuff to work on. I'm currently working on the second season of what was that show? Carnival Row. Thank you.
Carnival Row. Yeah.
We're on a bit of a break, and I'm tired, so I forgot the name of it. And my my other gig is Dynasty. I don't know if you guys get Dynasty. I think you do on Netflix down there. Which we just got renewed for season 5. Again, not quite sure why, but wow. Apparently there are a bunch of people out there that love it. So we have a good time on that show, and we actually do a really nice job on it. You know, it is a bit of a soap opera, but we have some of the best sound people and mixers in Hollywood working on that show. So I'm still proud of the work we do on it. I can't think of anything else. Oh, Andres and I worked on a little film called Libertador. You pronounce it because you pronounce it so much better.
Libertador, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I still to this day cannot do that.
That was a running joke, right? Through the whole production.
It was a running joke, yeah. Kept trying, kept failing.
You got it. Close it.
Little tiny movie about Simón Bolívar. That was really just an amazing, epic film that we worked on for well over a year. Went to Venezuela for a couple of weeks at one point to record. And it was quite an experience. That's where I met and got to know Andres and what we have in common. We stayed in touch since then. I guess that's it. I will go ahead and start this presentation, which I've put together. It's not meant to be completely comprehensive. I'm sure I've left some things out that may come up hopefully in discussions. If you guys had any questions, you can interrupt at any time, or Andres can interrupt at any time to address those. We'll start with theory. I've got the whole thing sort of divided between.
Before you get started, I just want to say for the people that are just coming in now, la clase va a ser en inglés por hoy, pero cualquier pregunta que tengan la pueden poner en español y yo se la traduzco a Jay. Entonces, bueno, go ahead.
So in discussing theory of sound design and supervision for post film and television, I'll go over some definitions. I'll go over some of the things that are important to me in my work, like collaboration, storytelling. Sound as a tool for creating and manipulating mood and emotion. Sound design versus music. It's not a contest, as I like to say. And communication, the language of sound design, which is often overlooked when creative sound people are trying to communicate with relatively new directors and producers about sound. Sometimes there's a lot lost in translation with that. So it's important to have a common understanding of the language. Let's get into some of the basic definitions, which I've listed as sound design, supervising sound editor, sound editing, which includes dialogue, sound effects, and the assistant sound editor, very important part of the crew. We'll talk about ADR, which stands for automated dialogue replacement, Foley, and its different elements, and mixing. When it comes to sound design, I feel like that there have always been two definitions for me. There's the broad one and the narrow one. The broad one for me is that the overall sound design is organically related to the narrative and thematic needs of the film. And it can refer to all aspects of a film's sound, all the way from the production to the final mix. So much like the set and costume designers, for instance, the sound designer is an artist who can be brought in during the planning stages of a film and work with the director to shape an overall consistent soundtrack that exploits the expressive possibilities of the sound medium in the service of telling a story. So, for me, it is one of the key positions, just like a lot of the big production positions. And when you're talking about sound design, you're talking about the overall scope of the entire sound job, which also includes music. The narrower definition of sound design, a sound designer, it can also refer to a person brought on to create just one kind of effect, or the conceptual or surreal sounds for a film that require custom composition. So, the sound designer could be the person that's brought in to create the sound specifically of Godzilla in the Godzilla movie, or specifically the sound of the alien in Alien, or the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park, for instance. Moving on, supervising sound editor, which is the common term in the US for what I do. I'll start by saying that ideally the first post-production sound person brought onto a film is the supervising sound editor, who not only directs and coordinates the creative contributions of the post-production sound staff, but also must handle all the related administrative duties that require coordination with all the other departments, like budget tracking and scheduling. It is also common for a supervising sound editor to participate in the hands-on sound editing and sound design, depending on the scope and size of the project and schedule. Personally, as a supervising sound editor, I like to be directly involved in the ADR and the sound design, and prefer sound design and supervision as a credit. That's normally what I try to have as a credit on film and television.
Right. Have you found that that has changed through the years, where before it was more segmented, and now, you as a supervising sound editor are asked to kind of wear more hats in a way, or oversee more things as things kind of get sort of, narrowed down in a bit?
Absolutely. I mean, every year that goes by, it seems like we are barreling towards, more and more change in this area, where more individuals wear more hats in the process. A perfect example of my own experience was on the HBO miniseries, The Defiant Ones. I was hired as the supervising sound editor, technically, but I was also the sound designer, and then I became the sound effects mixer, the re-recording mixer on the show, as well, because it just made sense in that particular case. And a lot of people that are traditionally sound supervisors or designers are mixing more and more. You're a good example of that. You consider yourself a re-recording mixer as well. And, you know, the technology has gotten to the point where the interfaces have become so integrated. You know, when you're working in Pro Tools these days, you are working in the same exact environment that mixers are, re-recording mixers are, and vice versa, obviously. The only difference might be the size of the console, the size of the physical interface that we're dealing with. You know, I might have a little tiny 8-fader interface, and my work is going to end up in a room with hundreds of faders. But yeah, I think that has changed over the years, especially after the complete transition to digital audio editing as opposed to film editing. It was virtually impossible on a big film project for one person to wear a lot of hats. You know, there was just way too much to be done. The work was too slow and too spread out. You know, the nature of working on MAG, it had to be separated out to many different people. I haven't worked on a project really since the film days. Well, maybe since, I guess Libertador was an example of a large film where, you know, you, for instance, were the ADR supervisor, as opposed to me, the supervising sound editor, doing the ADR, which I normally do nowadays on my projects. Give you an example of how big a film crews used to get, sound film crews used to get. On The Fugitive, I can remember a week where we had no less than 80 individuals working on the sound at once in 5 different buildings.
Wow.
It was pretty insane. Well, what happened on that project is they had a couple of really good test screenings, really good, like 98, 99 good in a row.
Right.
And they decided they had to get the sucker into theaters, and this was going to be a 3,000 screen release. And at the time, which was 93, that was huge. Huge undertaking. And so we had to mix in 4 or 5 different rooms at the same time, print master half the show, and then mix the second half in print master just so that they could start printing film prints to send out all over the world.
Wow.
Crazy. When I think about what we do today and how compact it's become, that still blows my mind to think about that.
Let me ask you, do you think, you know, the need in those days of that amount of manpower, do you think that had something to do with, because nowadays with the digital tools, things are somewhat, I don't want to say easier, but, you know, you can get a lot more done with the tools at hand. Things are a lot more streamlined. How much of it do you think it's because of the tools? How much of it do you think it's just because of budgets and just like workflow? Or, you know,
yeah,
you know, people not wanting to pay for an 80-person sound team for a couple of weeks.
Well, it started with the tools, and of course, you know, if you're a producer and you see that something can be done quicker and cheaper once, then it's, in your mind, it's always going to get done quicker and cheaper, no matter what, moving down the road. And so that happens naturally. But it obviously started with the technology. When you're working in a digital audio environment, on a digital audio workstation, DAW, you are working in an environment that doesn't have a whole lot of limits.
Right.
Certainly, as opposed to working on film, where you're working on one piece of mag at a time, one sound at a time, cutting it on an ancient piece of equipment called a moviola, and hanging it in a trim bin for an assistant to build into a film reel. That's a pretty slow process compared to being able to cut every single element of a particular discipline in a single session for even a big film.
Right.
You can have many hundreds of tracks in a session, no problem. So yeah, I mean, that really changed everything. It took a little while for the industry, especially with the bigger studio projects, to cross over, because, you know, they tend to move a little like dinosaurs in the industry compared to smaller operations in the music industry. But eventually we got there. I think the efficiency of it and the cost savings of it compared to what things used to cost obviously keep the ball rolling in that direction. You know, there is no turning back to doing it, you know, any differently or going back to doing it the way it was done. That's like opening up Pandora's box. So once you open it up and those possibilities are there, you're just going to keep barreling forward. That's what we've done, I think. It's unfortunate, you know, from the standpoint of a person in the industry trying to make a living, which, you know, it makes it more difficult to make a living doing it as a full-time job, because I think that the jobs are a fraction of the length that they used to be in general, you know. And so when you used to be able to survive doing a handful of jobs a year, people like you and me, we've got to have a lot more than that, you know, in terms of film or small projects that are, you know, they come and are finished within the course of a handful of weeks or a month or so. You know, if you're on a TV show, it's slightly different, especially one with 22 episodes like Dynasty. That's a nice job for most of the year, so that's great. Hope that kind of answered the question.
Definitely, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Moving on, get some of these definitions out of the way. Sound editing. And I apologize in advance for if a lot of you are already familiar with all these terms, but I figured we should start with the basics. Dialogue editing, probably overall the most important discipline to making sure that a film has a successful sound job. In order for the production audio recorded on the set or on location to be properly mixed, a dialogue editor needs to properly prepare it. So that includes eliminating extraneous noise from the tracks, you know, bumps and creaks and anything that might be distracting or sound like a set. Smoothing out the edits left by the picture editor, who is simply in a hurry to put together the movie and isn't really paying close attention to, you know, technically smooth sounding edits in the sound. It includes finding alternate takes from which to work. Prepping tracks for ADR, which we'll get into in a minute, laying it all out for final mixing. And typically this is a specialized discipline still in this industry. It requires a special set of skills to be a very good dialogue editor, in my experience. And again, because we've gotten into a realm where there are so many more tools at our disposal for doing these things, that lends itself to being a more specialized discipline, because you have to know so much more about so many more things to actually be very good at it these days. You know, you're expected to be able to use lots of plugins to get noises out, Isotope being one of the main ones, Isotope RX, and you're expected to know how to EQ hums and buzzes out of the track and deliver really clean sounding dialogue to the mix. The other main discipline of sound editing is sound effects editing, which is the process of adding sound effects, what we call backgrounds, which are airs, rivers, birds, traffics, things that basically just run steady from the beginning of a scene to the end of the scene. And also hard effects. We refer to things like gunshots, door slams, body falls as hard effects, specific things that don't run for a long time, that you're expected to cut and sync to what's going on. And the other very, very important part of the sound editing crew is the assistant sound editor. The chief functions of an assistant sound editor are to interface with their counterpart in the picture editorial department in order to facilitate the smooth turnover of materials from the picture department to the sound department, organize and distribute those materials to the sound editors as needed, and create an assembly of the production audio clips used by the picture editor from the original sound dailies for the dialogue editor to work with. Part of the dialogue editing job is to work with the original audio, and there's software that auto-conforms all that original audio using an EDL from the picture department to assemble all of the different channels of every single take used in sync to picture. And that's what the dialogue editor starts with.
Now, and just to clarify, because I think that I want to say this is one of the most common mistakes that you see in sort of smaller filmmaking and short films and yeah, just kind of smaller productions in general. And I think it's an important thing to kind of go over, if you don't mind,
Sure.
why we do that and why, because we get some like an OMF or an AAF, or, we get stuff from an editor, and, maybe if it's a decently mixed production sound, if you don't know any better, you can, you see one channel and you say, oh, this sounds fine. This is it. And people just, without realizing that that's a needed step, will just start editing, and that'll be the dialogue on the film, right? So, like, do you mind kind of explaining a little bit more, like, why is that so important? Like, what are we missing by not doing that?
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of really quick and dirty, down and dirty, and temp mixes, as we call them, mixes that are done very quickly without a full sound job for a test screening, for instance. Those are done just using the editor's tracks, which are turned over to the sound department in the form of an OMF or an AAF. These are open media file formats that allow the transfer of what the editor had in his Avid into Pro Tools, so that all of those tracks appear in Pro Tools the way that the editor had them. And then we can continue to work on them from there, or we use it as a reference. The reason it's very important to go back to dailies for a final mix is that often what the editor works with are the mixdown tracks from the production sound mixer. The typical setup for production sound is for an actor will have an isolated mic on them, a lavalier mic, and that'll be sure to get all of everything that they're saying close up, because the boom may not catch everything. Then you have the boom mic, which is catching as much as it can, and ultimately will probably sound a little better, a little richer, a little fuller than the lavalier mic recordings. But because the boom never perfectly captures everything from take to take and angle to angle, you really need those lavalier mic recordings as well to make everything work. And often what we do nowadays, because we can align the two sounds in such a way that they don't phase, is dialogue editors will supply both almost all the time, if they exist, to get the fullest, richest, most dynamic sounding dialogue that you can get with both the boom and the ISO mic from each actor. So if you have a scene with 3, 4, 5 actors, the production mixer could be recording up to 8 channels of sound for every take. Each actor would have his own channel. There'd be a mix channel. Sometimes there'll be a second boom if the action takes place over a big enough space, so that you might need a boom in one part of the location and another boom in another part. And then you'll have the mix down that the production mixer is, sometimes writing levels on, just to make sure that it's not distorted or not too low. But that's really just for the picture editor to work with in his edit, not really meant to be the final sound that we try to put together for the final mix, because we're trying to put together the most polished, cleaned up version of dialogue we can, so it's easy to understand, has minimal distractions married to it, and then we can go ahead and do the job of putting everything else in without worrying about that, without worrying about having to protect the dialogue so much, because it's nice and clean and robust, which you're not really going to get from just working with the editor's tracks. You're just not going to have as many choices. Does that make sense?
Complete sense. And so, I guess I'll just say that in order to be able to do a good assembly, and this is assuming that a lot of the people watching maybe are not in a Hollywood film team, sound film team. So talking about things that are maybe good to mention to keep in track is, a clean set of EDLs is a very important thing. and then communication between the editorial department and the sound department to get the right material.
That's a great point. That's a great point, Andres. Yeah, and to reiterate that,
you send back an EDL. I mean, you know, unless you're working.
Yeah, it seems like a little sort of obscure technical part of the process, but this is where the collaboration, and I'm going to talk about this a little later on in the presentation, but the collaboration between the assistant sound editor and the picture assistant, the assistant picture editor, is really important. And the sooner that they start getting together and going through materials and specs, trying out EDLs, making corrections, the better, because all that should happen well before the first official turnover happens. So that when the first official turnover happens, you're not then spending days going back and forth correcting errors. You're ready to hit the ground running. So often what will happen at the beginning of a project is my assistant will make contact with the picture assistant very early on, and they'll start exchanging specs. We'll ask for a test EDL. We'll let them know, what works, what didn't work, and we'll get it all ironed out before we get to that turnover.
Exactly. And that saves literally hours worth of work when you do that right versus when you don't.
Oh, exactly. Well, if once you get past having a clean EDL turned over, the assistant can put an assembly together within minutes sometimes with a solid EDL, because it's all done automatically with software. Of course, we have to go through and check it all, but the more of that stuff you work out beforehand, the better. So early communication between the two departments is really, really helpful, really important, really helpful.
Thanks, Jay. Jay, one thing, do you mind putting your presentation in full screen? I'm being asked to ask you.
Oh, it is in full screen. Is it not?
I think there might be.
I mean, it's on my full screen. Hang on. That might be a function of
or something. Never mind. Disregard. But you can keep going.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that it's an option to go more full screen than this, and I guess that would be on your end in StreamYard, no?
I think it might be like that little presentation button. Don't worry, we can keep going.
Little presentation button.
On the bottom, next to the slider, maybe?
This? No.
We can keep going. It's okay.
Okay, sorry about that.
I don't really know how it's done either, so I don't want to make you push the wrong button and who knows.
I mean, on the monitor I'm using for the PowerPoint, it's full screen. I don't know if I could
Makes sense.
Go any more full screen on yours on the StreamYard. Cool. All right, so moving on. Definition of ADR. ADR stands for automated dialogue replacement. In cases where the production audio is too noisy or otherwise unusable, because it's a bad line reading, an actor flubs a line, an airplane flies by, a truck drives by, whatever it might be, the line will be cued for ADR by either the ADR supervisor or the supervising sound editor. And this means that replacing that line or lines of dialogue using the process of automated dialogue replacement. Process takes place on an ADR stage, which is a specialized recording studio where the actor can record lines in sync with the picture. And I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. Once a replacement line of dialogue has been recorded, the ADR editor will check the sync carefully, editing the take if necessary to precisely match it to picture. It's got to look exactly right, otherwise it'll look and sound and feel like ADR in the final product, which will be a distraction as a viewer. The process is also known as looping. Those of us old enough to have been in the industry, myself included, unfortunately, used to call it looping because many years ago, when we worked on film, the ADR editor would actually bring the 35 millimeter picture, the film, in loops to the ADR stage where it would be projected over and over again in a loop for the actor to do it over and over again. And so that's why they actually called it looping. Some of us call it looping still today. Here is a picture of a typical ADR stage, at least in Los Angeles. There you see the actor in the middle of the room with headphones on, and there's a boom mic and a secondary boom mic a little further away, and she also has a lavalier mic on her as well, and she's got cue sheets in front of her with the line, and then she has the picture projected on a screen where she'll see herself and say the line in sync to what she's watching. Here's where the supervisor sits so that he can have direct contact with the actor and give suggestions and evaluate whether or not it needs to be done again for whatever particular reason. Maybe the sync wasn't good. Maybe the timbre of the actor's voice wasn't the same as it was on the day. One of the more important jobs of the supervisor in an ADR setting is to make sure that the takes that we get are going to be close enough to actually work in the mix. So all that happens in a room like that. There are lots of different incarnations of an ADR stage, but that's a typical looking one. Next, we've got Foley. Sounds that are created by recording human movement in sync with picture. That's the technical definition of Foley. It's different from the environmental backgrounds and hard effects that comprise editing sound effects. Foley effects are sounds like footsteps, prop movement, cloth rustling, etc. The people involved in this process are the Foley mixer, who's the engineer that records the sound, and the Foley walkers, also called Foley artists sometimes, who create those sounds. Typically in a large soundstage equipped with different flooring surfaces called pits. They need to be deep to sound authentic. For instance, if you have a dirt pit, the rule is generally to be 6 feet deep so that you don't actually hear whatever the surface is underneath, whether it's concrete or wood. If it's not deep enough, it'll never actually sound like real dirt. After the Foley effects are recorded, the Foley editor will make any slight filming timing adjustments necessary to ensure that they are exactly in sync with the final picture. Sometimes he'll also coordinate with the sound effects editor at the same time, because there will be some things that the sound effects editor will prepare from a sound library that will need to be in dead sync with what's captured on the Foley stage. And you'll want to either use both sounds together or have the choice, but they'll need to be coordinating a little bit as far as that stuff goes. And the Foley editor or Foley supervisor will also cue all the desired Foley effects prior to recording. So, you know, before a Foley crew starts on a project, typically they'll get they used to be cue sheets. We used to actually make paper cue sheets. Now we just do Pro Tools sessions. We'll create clips in a Pro Tools session that are named and have direction in them and are exactly in the timeline where we want the Foley effect. And so they'll follow that guide. Typically, Foley is divided up into 3 categories: footsteps, which you'll often see abbreviated as FS, movement, and props. And typically those 3 things are done separately. It's easier for Foley artists or walkers to do all the footsteps, for instance, for all the characters first while they're in that mode. And then they'll do all the props, and then probably a movement pass, which includes a cloth pass. They'll sit there for the entire length of the reel or the episode or whatever it is and just move cloth close to the mic in sync with all the characters. It really helps to have that extra layer when you're using ADR and you've lost the production sound there. And for what we call an M&E, which we'll talk about a little later when we talk about deliverables.
Also, I would say for the context of, you know, a lot of the stuff that we're doing down here, where a lot of times there's going to be overdubbed in multiple languages, it's very, very important. You're talking about the M&E to have what's called the fully filled.
Fully filled, yes.
fully filled.
Which heavily relies on Foley, probably more so than the final domestic mix that's done in the native language. One little bit of history, that's, if you ever wondered why it's called Foley, it's named after a gentleman named Jack Foley, who is an old-time Hollywood sound effects guy, and he is generally regarded the father of this craft. He invented it, best known for his work on Spartacus. He was born in the late 1800s, died, I think, in the late 60s. And this is a typical Foley stage. I mean, obviously, like ADR stages, they come in many different shapes and sizes and incarnations, but this gives you a really good idea of not only the space, the environment of a Foley stage, but what it looks like to see a Foley artist working. You know, he's got a big projected image. He's got a little TV screen he can focus on as well, and he's all mic'd up. And right in this particular example, he is making the sound of this actor's hand go across the blade of a sword. And so when you hear that in its final incarnation, whether it's in a movie theater or on TV, what you're going to hear mostly is the sound that he's creating in this room for that particular action. This picture doesn't really show the flooring very well, but you can see, you know, there are a few rectangles in the foreground here, and those are the Foley pits, the different flooring. You've got wood, you've got grass, you've got dirt. And on a large Foley stage, you're going to have a handful of those pits. And you're also going to have an incredible amount of props. It's going to look like a big mess. A really, really good big Foley stage looks like a real chaotic mess with all of the various props that they've collected over the years of doing it. You'll see that there's a full body armor there in the background in this particular stage. A lot of Foley stages will have an actual car door to create sounds using that particular type of metal, for instance. Any questions before moving on?
I think there's some more general ones that we can leave for the end. Nothing really specific to
great.
Yeah, to what we're talking about. Yeah, but I think that's all been very clear.
Cool. Well, let's talk a little bit about mixed.
Yeah. I'll ask you something just in a very synthesized, simple way. Like, how do you, like, what is the difference between Foley and like sound effects, or like what a sound editor does versus like what a Foley artist does? How do you decide that in the middle of a production, or like what gets doubled up, or?
The best example I can give of a situation where you would use a sound effect and not use a Foley would be like a big action fight sequence. You know, we would tend to lean on the sound effects of the punches and the body falls. Even though a lot of body falls are created on a Foley stage, you know, the whooshes for the punches and the leg kicks, the really big, impactful sounds that require a lot of weight, you would tend to lean on things that have been created and exist in a sound effects library, as opposed to things that are shot live on a Foley stage. Obviously, footsteps are the most commonly known type of Foley effect. We've all, at one time or another, had to cut footsteps out of a sound library, and that's nothing short of torture for a sound editor. So you generally like to rely on Foley for that sort of thing. Also, the subtle, specific movements. That's not something that you're going to cut from a library. That's something you're going to rely on a performance, really, from an artist to create. But, you know, things like gunshots and door closes and punches and, you know, car chases, those are things that are going to be cut from a sound effects library and not be bothered with on a Foley stage. But anything that's really specific, that requires a bit of a performance, is automatically going to be done as Foley. And there is a fair amount of overlap if you are dealing with a large project with a good budget where you don't have to really worry about skimping on how much time you spend on the Foley stage. There are a lot of talented Foley artists out there that can deliver an amazing array of Foley effects to cover a fight, for instance. It's not common, but you can do it. Really depends on the budget of the project, the time that you have, the quality of the Foley artists, etc. But for the most part, you differentiate by deciding, what do I need from Foley because it's specific, and what don't I need from it because I've got a lot of good library effects to cover it. Does that help?
That's perfect, yeah.
Great.
Not to belabor, but do you feel like Libertador maybe was a good example of that, of Foley and sound effects working together and all the battle scenes and all the...
Oh, it was a great example of it, I thought. Yeah, and you know, there are a lot of cases where you end up liking both elements and they work really well together, which is why I talked a little bit about the collaboration between the Foley editors and the sound effects editors. You know, very often, especially with the big action movies, you're going to do a lot of layering to cover big events on the screen. And sometimes that layering is going to include a handful of different types of sound effects from the library and also some Foley to go with it. And sometimes all of it together works great. And sometimes you make some choices. I'm a big believer in specificity, but you know, there are cases where you'll layer a few things together and that'll be the best option. That'll be what sounds the best and the biggest and the fullest. Libertador was a great example of that, though, because there was so much detail to be covered in those battle scenes. You know, I'll tell you, because we had horses in that movie, that's a really good example of something that Foley artists used to do a very long time ago with, like, hollowed out coconuts, for instance. They might cover horse hooves, but that is sort of an unacceptable approach these days. We have enough great recordings of horses and sound libraries now to do that properly with the real thing. So it's horses are never anything you would cover on a Foley stage anymore these days.
No more.
No more of that. No.
Thank you.
Although you would cover the movement of the leather saddle, you know, you would cover the reins in Foley, you know, the things like that. All right, let's talk about mixing. Just from a terminology standpoint, to be clear, there are several different types of mixers in production and post-production. Starting in order, the production sound mixer is in charge of the team recording the live dialogue in sync with the camera team on set, on location, and captures it all over multiple channels from boom mics and isolated microphones attached to the actors in the scene. We talked a little bit about that when we discussed the dialogue editing. That's a very different type of mixer than post-production mixers, but they're still called mixers. ADR and Foley mixers are actually the engineers that record the ADR and Foley. Since ADR and Foley are recorded directly into digital audio workstations these days, mostly Avid Pro Tools, using mixing console interfaces, they have commonly become known more as mixers than engineers, but that's really semantics. They're not doing a whole lot of actual mixing in terms of moving faders around that make a difference in what they're doing, but they are referred to as mixers, ADR mixers and Foley mixers nowadays, more so than engineers. And then you've got re-recording mixers. They have the responsibility of balancing the various elements, all the dialogue, ADR, music, sound effects, Foley effects in the final mix. On particularly large action films, there can be 3 mixers working side by side at a large console with hundreds of faders. though this is less and less common these days. What's more common out here is a 2-mixer team. But when you have a 3-mixer team on a very large project, the dialogue mixer typically commands the mixing stage. He's typically the lead mixer. And the other 2 mixers are the effects mixer and the music mixer. But like I said, more commonly these days, there are only 2, and the lead mixer handles dialogue, ADR, and music, while the other handles all sound effects, sound design, and Foley. That's usually the differentiation. Also, what is common on very large features with tight deadlines is using several different teams of mixers working simultaneously in different mixing studios in order to complete the mix by the release date. A good example of this, like I said, was in my history, was The Fugitive. I believe we were on 5 different stages at one point. 2 final mixing stages and 3 pre-mixing stages. We'll get into the various forms of re-recording mixing as well when we talk about the workflow. And here is just a couple of visual examples of mixing stages. The one on the left is a stage at Sony. This is a typically large stage that typically large action movies are done on. The console can accommodate up to 3 mixers if need be. Looks like at the moment they're working with 2 mixers. And then the picture on the left is more typical of a smaller, lower budget world in features and television, where the mixes are much shorter and quicker and don't really require moving around a lot of air in a big room, because they are really specifically for the small screen mostly. But again, like ADR stages and Foley stages, there are thousands of different incarnations of mixing stages. I think, you know, the room that you see Andre sitting in right now probably serves as a mixing stage for him on certain projects, if he mixes in his own system. So it really is all about a combination of what the project demands, what the budget is, what the time frame is, what the resources are, you know, where you end up mixing. Let's see. These are just some additional definitions. It's by no means meant to be comprehensive, but off the top of my head, these are a few sound terms that may not mean a whole lot to people that aren't in the industry or haven't been in the industry for a while. Room tone. It is exactly what it sounds like. It's other terms of presence or atmosphere or ambience. It's a location's oral fingerprint. Non-specific sounds in the upper end of the hertz spectrum, 2,000 to 8,000 hertz typically. But it's basically just air. It's the room tone from a particular location that the film has shot in. Each location has a distinct presence of subtle sounds created by the movement of air in a particular volume, in a particular space. So a microphone placed in 2 different empty rooms will produce different room tone for each. Each room will sound different. Room tone is recorded during production sound recording or can be captured as a sound effect recording after the fact. Room tone is used to match the production sound track so that it may be intercut with the track and provide a continuous sounding background. Be very useful for that. Room tone may smooth out edit points and give a feeling of life in a sound deadened studio. So dialogue editors rely on the actual room tone from the production to do their work. And additionally, sound effects editors may use room tones as well as part of their ambience builds, because you're going to want a certain amount of air as an element in any particular location.
And that's just to add that, just like what we were saying on the EDL before.
Yeah.
For the production, and because I know a lot of the people that are watching us are maybe ADs or just producers to some extent. So to take the time in each space and each scene to just do 1 minute of complete silence room tone can literally save hours in post-production time after the fact, right?
Exactly.
Like when you're editing dialogue, if you know, of course, there's nowadays with ambient match, there's ways to go around it, but you know, if you do have the right room tone, it's just gonna make your production, you know, go a lot smoother, your post-production. So
it's infinitely useful to have, you know, long sections of clean room tone from the actual locations that all the dialogue was recorded in.
Right. And even I know it always under a minute is like plenty, right? To think about, you know, to think about having, you know, just for producers and for people that work on set out there that are listening, I just wanted to stress out that, like, to take the time in each scene, in each space, to just take 30 seconds of silence is gonna, you know, it's gonna literally make your movie sound better.
Especially the reason that it's, sorry, go ahead.
No, go. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say the reason that it's a good idea to do it before everything gets moved out of the space, you know, before the set gets broken down and the next shot is set up, is that sound is going to change. You know, if the production sound mixer actually go back after the fact to that space and it's been cleared out and there's no people in it and there's no equipment, it's actually going to sound a little different. You know, and the most useful way to capture that room tone to be used by us in post sound is to do it in that moment, you know, before you move the shot. And I know it may seem like torture to a producer who's under the gun, but you know, 30 to 60 seconds of silence when you're done shooting a scene in a location is really worth it. It's a good point, Andres. Thank you for bringing that up.
And while I have you, kind of going back a little bit with mixing, we had a question from the audience regarding specifically ADR and Foley mixers. If we can have it up. Question is from a Tropics company.
I see it.
There you go.
What are the tasks covered by the ADR and Foley mixers? How deep the treat sound? Are they offering reverb? Okay. In general, you do not want to have ADR or Foley mixed in the sense that you're not going to want to change the original sound. You're not going to want to add anything, EQ it, add any reverb to it. In general, you want that sound to be as clean as possible so that we have the option to treat it in any way that it needs to be treated to mix it into our final mix. So if you're adding any room or reverb to an ADR recording, for instance, you're running the risk of you're creating a product that won't naturally or easily fit in to where it needs to fit into. You know, if it's ADR that's replacing a line in a scene, and it's got some different room reverb or EQ that you've added as a mixer, it's going to work against you. You want it to be as clean and as flat as possible so that you're starting with a pure sound that you can then manipulate however you need to manipulate it in order to mix it in to your final mix to make it match the original production dialogue. In terms of Foley, it kind of depends on what world you're working in, to be honest. When it comes to film, I want my Foley to be as flat as possible. I don't want it to sound like it's got any room on it. I don't want it to be cued in any way. I may want, you know, some of the original room rumble to be rolled off. You know, I don't need to hear that, and as long as it doesn't affect the dynamic fullness of the sound. But I'm going to want it to be as flat as possible. I'm just going to want it to sound as clean and dry as possible so that I can then do whatever I want to do to it as a sound designer. Now in television, because we work so much more quickly, creating the product and mixing the product, often Foley artists and mixers will actually add a little room reverb to the Foley, to the footsteps, to the props, that will, to their best estimation, match what they're hearing on the guide track for what's actually happening in that room. And that ends up saving the final mixer a little time, because there's so little time to actually mix sometimes 42 minutes of a show together, that, there's not a whole lot of time to spend on finding the exact right reverb for the Foley. So sometimes we don't mind a little of that being added in for TV, but you have to be careful, because if you go too far, it becomes less and less useful to us in the final product. Does that help?
That does help. So ultimately, really, it's the re-recording mixer, the one that ultimately would make those decisions as far as like each thing is. Maybe
the editor. I mean, if there did need to be a little denoising, let's say that the Foley had a little rumble on it just from the natural sound of the room and the mic and where the mic was placed on the recording, then I would leave it up to the editor to roll that off, or the designer or the supervisor. You could deliver it to the mix that way and let the final mixer do it. But that's the sort of thing that we could do beforehand to save the mixer a little time, as long as we don't go too far. Again, you've got to know what you're doing. If you roll too much off and you make it too thin, then again, it becomes less useful. Right. So it's something you have to be a little careful of. In general, we like to leave the mixing to the mixers. We do like to keep that separation, because if we go too far, we have to then unravel what we did, which will be time consuming and annoying. But there are times when a mixer might receive something that is really noisy in a way that would have been easy for us to eliminate, and he would appreciate us eliminating it. So you kind of have to take that on a case-by-case basis. If it's a real down and dirty quick mix where you're really going to be pressed for time, then you want to do as much of that stuff as you can before sending it to the mix within reason. If it's a nice long mix, where you're spending weeks putting it all together, and the mixers have time to pre-mix and spend time with the material to do those things on their own, you let them do it. That's my take on that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Very clear.
Moving on to another definition, walla. This is a word, again, kind of like looping for ADR, that's has its roots in old Hollywood. What it means is a sound effect for the murmur of a crowd in the background. That's typically what we refer to as walla in post-sound editorial. The word walla was created in the old radio days when they needed the sound of a crowd in the background. They would gather several people together in the studio and have them simply say walla, 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 walla. And it sounded like people talking, and recorded at the right level, mixed at the right level, it would work as general background murmur. Because the final product, it didn't play loud enough to actually hear the word walla. It just sounded like a murmur. So that's why they call it walla, because they actually used to say walla, 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 walla to create the sound. Another term that you'll hear a lot is loop group. This is a function of ADR recording, but it also involves actors. Actors that are not part of the original cast. These are professional actors that are hired to add real words and real conversations to a scene with background extras who were, of course, only pretending to speak on the day that the scene was shot, because you wouldn't want to actually hear them speaking. So what they were doing on the day was miming. So their mouths were flapping away, but nothing was coming out. So when we have to put together the final soundtrack, we're going to need to fix that. We're going to need to we're going to need it to sound as if they were talking, but we'll have complete control over that sound. But because we do see specific things in the background, we hire real actors that come on and record that stuff in a room, in an ADR stage, looking at picture that's projected up on the wall on a screen, so that it can be as close to authentic as possible. It can look as real as possible. The loop group actors come prepared. They have been informed of the period and locale of the film and have researched the local jargon and geography so that the background dialogue will sound authentic. If they're a good loop group, they've done their homework. And if you're a good supervisor, you've given them all the materials they need to do their homework. Generally, a loop group wrangler, leader, will get a sneak peek at the film in advance so that they can go through the process of casting the actors needed and assigning the various specific things to those actors. The material is mostly improvised. Loop group Walla has to be edited very skillfully, like sound effects, so that it does not sound artificially placed. This is another thing to keep in mind. It's, a lot of what we record in a loop group session is great, but a lot of it needs a lot of editing. A lot of it needs to be thinned out, weeded through, edited to be put in exact sync. Otherwise, again, it doesn't really work. If something's out of sync and somebody's watching a scene and it becomes clear for some reason that something's not quite right sync-wise, it'll become a distraction to the viewer. It's usually the ADR supervisor that works with the loop group. And in my case, it's me. I usually supervise the ADR on my projects. It's actually one of the more fun things about my job is working with a loop group. It's always a good time. And loop group is also used to add specific lines that are meant to be heard coming from things like a radio or a television or a loudspeaker. If you have a scene shot in a hospital, you might have the loop group actors record some specific hospital pages to be heard in the mix. If you have a scene with an actor driving in a car that has the radio on, you might use the loop group to create a fictional talk show that's heard on the radio in the mix. That's an example of ways in which you'd use a loop group to do more than just cover the background activity. Another phrase that you'll hear a lot in post-production sound is sweeten. Audio sweetening is a catch-all phrase for fine-tuning sound in post-production. More specifically, though, to sweeten or to use a sweetener refers to subtly mixing in an additional sound with a pre-existing sound. So you're sweetening that pre-existing sound, much like adding sugar to a dessert, you're sweetening it. For example, in the film Backdraft, this is an old example, but most people are probably familiar with that film. The sounds of wolves howling were faintly added to the sound of fire crackling to sweeten it and give it a haunting animal-like quality. Another example I can think of off the top of my head was Twister. Animal sounds were used extensively, mixed in with the sounds of wind to create a more dynamic, more interesting, moody version of what a twister might sound like in real life. Another not word, but acronym that you'll come across quite a bit is MOS. There's apparently been a lot of debate over what it actually refers to, but it does actually refer to motor-only sync, which comes from when the sound department would actually be literally in sync with the picture, with the cameras rolling. And if there was no sound, it would be motor-only sync. It would be just the camera. And so it in short means that a shot or a scene was filmed without sound. That's all it means. But we still use MOS to this day. So if you see that, that's what it means. Something was shot without sound. Let's see. Moving on from definitions. So if anybody has any specific questions about any of the definitions or has any other words that they would like to discuss in terms of what they mean in post-production sound, now might be a good time to do that. What about you, Andres? Can you think of anything that I certainly not a comprehensive list by any means, but
yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything you left out, but those are all pretty good ones. Sweden, MOS. Yeah, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but
okay,
it's all pretty clear. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So a big part of what needs to happen in post-production sound is collaboration. It's I don't think it can be overstated, the importance of collaboration in what we do. There are a lot of moving parts to a sound job. It requires a lot of coordination. Some examples: picture editorial department and the sound editorial department. The coordination there is mostly a function of the assistants from both departments interfacing. We talked about that a little bit earlier when we talked about the definition of assistant sound editor, but this is really, really, really important. This has to be established early on in the project, and the kinks need to be worked out, the bugs need to be worked out so that things run smoothly when they have to, when the turnover happens. And when picture changes happen, anything that involves turning over to sound, those assistants need to be in lockstep with each other. Post-production supervisor and the supervising sound editor. Now, we didn't talk about what a post-production supervisor is, and I think that might have been covered in another masterclass in this series. I don't know, but yeah. So, but basically, in short, a post-production supervisor is a person that does the majority of the coordinating needed to schedule all the various things that happen in post sound. For us, it's scheduling ADR sessions, it's scheduling mixes, it's interfacing with everybody else in post on the picture side of things and on the producer side of things. You have to keep track of budgets as a supervising sound editor. Unfortunately, it is one thing that you do have to keep track of. You've got to be on top of the scheduling. You've got to be on top of changes that come down the pike. There's rarely such a thing as locked picture the first time around when you received a quote unquote locked picture, unless they've completely shut down the editorial suites. You should almost always count on additional changes coming your way. And so picture changes present their own set of challenges in terms of coordination and scheduling and budget, all of that stuff.
Would you say, I mean, outside of a large studio or maybe even in a place like Formosa, would you say staffing is part of the supervising sound editor's job, as far as, deciding the dialogue editor you want to work with, the sound designer you want to work with, or if you do it yourself, or so on and so forth?
Yeah. Again, it depends on the situation and the company that you're working within. Formosa is a big company with a lot of sound editors to feed, and while they will normally give the supervising sound editor plenty of leeway to hire his own people, because that is an important aspect of running a sound crew, is knowing the sound crew and being able to rely on them, and having a shorthand with them. People that you've worked with over and over again, they learn, they get to know and learn what you like, what you expect, what the bar is, all that stuff. So for me, it's very important to be able to pick my own people, and I generally demand that type of autonomy. That would be the most important aspect of it for me. I don't always get what I want working at a place like Formosa. They're great. Everybody there is great. Sometimes I'm told, look, this person, we need to give him some work. This is a supervisor that's out of work, so he says he's willing to edit. That's happened to me a bunch of times, and that's fine. Usually it's a win-win for me to have a talented supervisor that I know is also a very good editor, work for me as an editor. That happened on Carnival Row, and the end result was amazing. I didn't have my normal.
Oh, sorry.
I didn't have my normal dialogue editor that I would have liked to have hired, but I ended up with somebody who I had no idea how talented they were as a dialogue editor, but he was a supervisor. So, but yeah, you generally, the sound supervisor hires his crew, and usually there is a certain amount of loyalty there as well. If you work enough, you hire the same people enough over and over again, and that just gets to be a good rhythm to the work in that way.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Just a couple of steps back, we have a question, and it's in Spanish, so I'll translate it. But it's kind of going over something that you already said, so just kind of like maybe clarifying that a little bit.
Sure.
If we can, si me muestras la pregunta. Dice SM, el diseño de sonido final. So what this says is, does the final sound design, is it always done to the final cut? Do you start the sound design once you have the final cut, whether it's on a movie or on a TV show?
That's a great question. And the answer is it varies. It depends on the project, the circumstances, the scheduling. I'll use Carnival Row as an example. Carnival Row is a show that has so many visual effects in it that there's no way I could wait until those were done in order to get started on the work. And, often as visual effects evolve, they require picture changes as well. Not always the case. Sometimes they can lock the picture so that the timings don't change, but that the visual effects continue to evolve in a way that requires the work to evolve with it. But the work can be so elaborate and require so much time to get right creatively that you've got to start before that work is finished. So to answer your question in that context, for instance, we mixed the first 5 episodes of the second season back in January and February and early March of this year, but I started working on the sound design of the show in September of the previous year, because there was a lot to sort through in terms of creating some of that sound design. And it needed to go through an extensive approval process back and forth, trying this, trying that. It took a long time. If I had waited until those visual effects were nearly completed, I would not have had time to do all of the work.
So 5 months, more or less 5 to 6 months before you actually had the final cut, you were already submitting,
yes,
working on sounds. Wow.
Yes. Now that might be an exception to the rule these days, especially, and may only really apply in situations where you have a lot of visual effects, where you have a big project that requires really elaborate sound design. To answer it the other way, very often projects will completely lock before turning over because it's expensive to make changes. Unless you've got a crazy deal with your sound team that they'll absorb all those changes without charging you, but that's not going to happen with me. So, if you turn something over and it starts getting worked on, and then you change it, as the client, the sound client, you're going to get charged for those changes because it's going to require work to update the sound. Okay. So generally, lower budget things do like to turn over locked. I mean, it is a desire. Television shows, for the most part, like to turn over locked because they'll be charged a lot of money to make changes after that fact because it's such a short turnaround. It really goes both ways. Ideally, you do want to wait to work on the sound until it's locked. So if the schedule allows for it, if the client is able to lock the picture and doesn't have to go back and make changes, that is the ideal situation for the most efficient way to work on sound on a project, is to have it be locked when it's turned over. Does that help?
That's perfect. And to add to that, what's your take or anything you want to say about how much do you see these days where maybe you get a script, or maybe even before shooting is starting or concurrent to actual shooting? Because one thing maybe we haven't talked about is field recorders, right? People that, and so maybe a show, let's talk about maybe Carnival Row or something like that, where there might be a specific sound or set of sounds or category of sounds that you're going to need, and so there might not be editing, but you might maybe in your own custom library, or commission a field recorder to go out there and and do stuff. How much, what's your take on that, or how much are you doing that these days?
Sure. I still, just because I'm a real geek about sound, if the need comes up to go out and record a new unique sound, I'm on it. I grab my little I'll show it to you right now. This is great. I recommend this to anybody that wants to get into field recording. The company Zoom makes these great little recorders. This is actually a 6-channel recorder if you've got all the cabling necessary and all the miking. But it, if I need to record a sound, what's great about it is I've got this with a couple of custom mics, and I can just hit the road and very easily record some custom sound, which I do often.
I believe that's the H6N, right?
Yeah, that's the Zoom H6. Highly recommend it. They make a handful of different mics that you can use for different situations. Highly recommend it.
Thank you.
The example that I think I'd like to use to answer your question is actually the Fast and the Furious. I did that film back in, I think it was 2000 was when we were working on it. I think it came out in 2001. It was the original Fast and the Furious. And for anybody that's familiar with the movie, obviously it's all about the cars. And we knew right off the bat, before we even saw a frame of this film, that we were going to have to record a lot of cars. I think we ended up recording about 50 different vehicles on that project. And we had, we basically rented out a small airport in the area that's about an hour and a half to 2 hours north of Los Angeles, called Agua Dulce Airport. We just rented the whole airport out because it was a small 2-runway airport, one for landing, one for taking off. And we would go out there with the cars. First of all, we'd have to find the cars. We ended up, I think, doing business with more than a few gang members, more than a few illegal street racers, but these were the guys that actually had the cars we wanted to record. So we would get the cars up there, and we'd have a team of recordists. Generally, we would work for a shoot like this. We would work with at least 4 or 5 recordists. We would mic the car up. We'd mic the engine up. We'd put 3 or 4 mics in the engine compartment, a mic by the tailpipe. Sometimes we'd mic up the side of the car as well, and then we'd have a person inside the car recording the stereo version from inside the car. And we would do a slate so that we could sync it all up later, and we would record the car doing just about everything we could think of making it do, so that we would have what we call a full series on that particular car for the library, not just for the show, not just for the movie we were working on, but if we're going to go through the trouble, we were going to get these sounds that could be used in other movies down the road as well. That would become a permanent part of our library, because it was certainly a lot of time and effort that went into recording these cars. So that's a perfect example of a situation, to answer your original question, where you would start doing a ton of recording before you even saw the film, knowing what you needed, and that also brings me to, if we want to talk about it a little later on, we can as well. There is a whole art and science to recording vehicles that has evolved over the years. You can find a lot of it online if you ever need to do it, but a guy named Charles Deenan is the master of recording cars. He has become the main authority in the US among sound designers. He was originally in charge of the game Need for Speed for many years. And he has developed the best methodology for recording vehicles that I've ever seen. So Google him, Charles Deenan, Deeneen, Denen.
D-E-N-E-N. Denen. D-E-N-E-N.
Thank you.
I'm surprised. I gotta say,
yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry. No. I mean, I'm not surprised at Charlie. It's amazing. But I would assume to hear John Fasal or Eric Potter, or at least John Fasal in that conversation. But
John Fasal is one of my favorite sound field recordists. I've hired him many times when I need something shot. He's the older school version of Charles. Charles is a lot younger. But John Fasal is the master when it comes to field recording. He's been around forever. He was a big part of The Fugitive because he was a part of Warner Brothers at the time. Did a lot of location recording for us and sound design for us on that show. And I've hired him from time to time because I know I can tell him what I need and not even worry about getting just the absolute best material back I could possibly get.
Amazing.
I do like to go out and record. Very often it's not an option for me, just scheduling wise. I'll have to hire somebody to do that for me. But anybody getting into the industry as a sound editor, definitely get into field recording as well, because it'll be a big part of what you do. And there's nothing better than building your own library from your own recordings. It doesn't get any better than that.
We have a question sort of tied more on the production side about this car stuff. From Alejandro, they ask, how do you handle the negotiations to record such things? Is there a standard fee to pay the guys you're recording, in this case, the car owners?
I would say there's no standard fee. Looking back on what we did for the Fast and the Furious, we would reach out, put the word out of what we wanted to get, and we would work out a deal with them. It really ends up being whatever it might be worth to the owner for his time and his vehicle for the day. It is the better part of a day in most cases to properly fully record one vehicle. Sometimes we would squeeze 2 into a day. If we were really well prepared, we'd get 2 complete series of a car in a day. But it's hard to do more than that in a day. And so generally when you're working out a deal with somebody, you say, we need the car for the day. You don't always want the owner of the car to be the driver during the recording, because sometimes you need a person that understands what you're after, which is a lot of incremental speeds of things. If the car owner is a very good driver and understands that, great. Then you pay him for his time in the car, but otherwise you ask if we can have a professional driver drive the car as part of the deal. I can recall paying as little as a couple $100 to as much as $1,000 for the day, for instance. When it comes to renting a car to do this type of work, you are asking the owner to hand over his car to basically become a stunt car, to basically run it through the paces, and certainly things can go wrong. Obviously, you need insurance as well. When we rented out the airport, we had to get a huge insurance policy to then go onto the runway and record. That'll vary depending on where you do the recording. A lot of lower budget situations, people will simply find locations that are free and out of the way. Obviously, if you're trying to do a major car record, you want to find a location that's as quiet as possible, away from the city, away from traffic, that doesn't get too windy, that's doesn't have a lot of air traffic. There are a lot of things that are difficult about finding a location like that. We, in the Los Angeles area, generally head north to the desert. If we're going to do it guerrilla style, as we say, without permits or anything, we'll head up to the Mojave Desert, where there is a lot of expansive, out-of-the-way space, but not necessarily a lot of pavement. So again, that's another consideration. The location that you're going to record the car on can't be dirt, if you're going to need to use the recordings for the car that's filmed on pavement. So, and vice versa. If you've got a car that is filmed on a dirt road, you're going to want a dirt road to record that car. The answer, unfortunately, is no, there's not a standard fee. And the negotiations are on a case-by-case basis. You know, I don't really know of a standard. I know of a lot of people that do it for a living, that record cars for a living, and so they have relationships with people that own cars, and they have things worked out with them. But yeah, I'm not personally aware of any sort of boilerplate contract for that type of thing.
Right. And I guess on the sound side of things, without going into fees, like, you know, the field recordist will have a day rate, and the supervisor will have a day rate, and all these things will kind of get added to the overall budget, right? On top.
So when I'm asked, what's it going to cost to record this car for, let's say, a car commercial that I'm doing, for instance, you know, I've got to work in my fee. I've got to work in the fee of at least 2 recordists, because I'm not going to do a car record with less than 2 recordists. You're going to need one guy on the outside with a handheld mic, and one guy on the inside of the car at the very least, in order to make it efficient enough. But the best scenario is to have a couple of extra recordists, so that you can get buys at the same time that you get starts and aways and ins and stops. If the track or the runway is long enough, you're going to want that, because that'll cut down on the time it takes to get all of those takes done as well, if that makes sense. Right. You've got one recordist at the beginning where the car starts up and drives away. And you've got another recordist in the midway point. The car drives by, so you get the buy. And that guy will have 2 mics, one that's stationary and one that he'll pan. So you'll have 2 separate types of recordings for that buy. And then you got the guy, like I said, inside the car, and the guy at the starting point of the car. That'll also record the car coming in and stopping. So ideally, you want at least 3 recordists. 4 are better than 3. 3 are better than 2. 1 makes it difficult.
Right.
So that's, that money will start adding up. Really, really good recordists that have their own equipment, which I like to use because I don't have to worry about renting equipment for them. They'll generally charge around $1,000 as a day rate, plus equipment rental. And that equipment rental, depending on how much he's renting to you, can be anywhere from a few hundred to maybe another 1,000, you know, depending on how elaborate the kit is. So yeah, it'll add up. You know, it's hard to do a real good elaborate car shoot the right way for less than $4 or $5 grand at the end of the day.
And somebody's asking on the chat too about recording cars, if it's 7.1 or stereo, and so it's not really a specific multi-channel format, right? You're just getting as many angles as you want, so that once you're editing,
each of the mics except for one is mono. Actually, you know, the mics that you have positioned in the engine compartment are all going to be mono mics, capturing particular areas of the engine compartment, because they're all going to sound a little different. You're going to want one where the intake is, to get that special sound of the intake when the car shifts. You're going to get one that doesn't have that sound, that's got more of the beefier engine part. The mic that's on the tailpipe is going to be a mono mic. Generally, we use high quality lavs for that, wrapped up in foam to protect them. And the one stereo mic will be the guy inside the car getting that particular angle. Now, all of the mics that are on the car and in the car can go to one recorder, can go to one multi-channel recorder. You know, and those, generally you'll want it to be an 8-channel recorder, so you have as many channels to play with as possible. But a 6-channel recorder will probably do the trick. You know, if you've got 3 or 4 mics on the car and one stereo, that'll be your 6 channels. And then the other guys that are in different parts of the track, obviously they'll have their own recorders. But no, we never do, I shouldn't say never, because I have actually seen 5.1 and 7.1 recordings of cars. It's not common, and it's not really necessary.
And it would be of
at
the
the end,
interior, right?
it would be of the interior mostly. Yeah. I mean, if you wanted to get, if you wanted to use a mic that was a 5.1 mic, for instance, and get the sound from the exterior of the car driving away in that format, you could do it. I don't know how useful it would be at the end of the day unless you had a situation on camera where you wanted to be immersed in that sound. But again, that can be created in the mix as well with mono and stereo recordings.
Yeah.
So it's pretty uncommon to use actual 5.1 recorders for cars.
So
mostly those are used to get capture environments.
Got it. So would you say for those out there listening that, you know, might not have access to Charles Deanon and, you know, his mic closet and recorder closet, would you say that for like let's say a Zoom H6 and you have 6 channels, you'd say a stereo interior, intake, exhaust, and then just engine bay somewhere, or wheel well maybe?
Yeah, maybe wheel well, that could be useful as well. Yeah, as long as you've got a way to mount that microphone where it won't get hit by dirt and rocks or destroyed in the process.
Right.
It's not always that easy. Sometimes it's a trial and error, and you learn the hard way. But yeah. And what's nice about the Zoom recorders is that they're relatively affordable. They're under $500 for the most part, if you look for a good deal. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Where were we? I was talking way too much, that's for sure. We were talking about collaboration. I think I was at the sound editorial team part, where internally, examples of collaboration amongst the team would be sound effects editors collaborating with Foley editors. I think I brought this up before, to ensure that sounds are not unnecessarily doubled up, or if you want them layered, they are in perfect sync with each other so that they don't sound doubled up in the mix. Dialogue and ADR editors must work together closely to ensure proper editorial and preparation for all dialogue. And a lot of times what happens when the ADR is shot and edited and the dialogue editor is working with that ADR, I know it'll happen with me personally because I'll take my dialogue editor's final edit session and then edit the ADR against it. I'll discover situations where I won't want to use the full line of ADR. Well, I'll want to use what we call a combo plate, where I'll use part of the ADR and part of the original line. And so I'll have to do a little editorial to make that work. But the only way to do that properly is to be doing it in that session. And so it's a form of collaboration there. You know, we may do an ADR session with an actor and an actor may refuse to do a line. That's happened to me before. And so I'll have to get back to the dialogue editor and say, hey, this line, you've got to save it. We couldn't get the actor to do it, or the director decided he didn't want it. So you need to make sure you're going to make that line sound as good as possible, because we're not going to have ADR for it. That's another example.
I remember.
Or we may add ADR in the ADR session, and then I have to get back to the dialogue editor to say, hey, you're going to have to prep this line as well because we added it in the session and the director really wants to use it. Whatever. Right. Go ahead.
No, I was just remembering an example of that where there was a sex scene that we were trying to ADR. I don't know if you remember that. And the actress, she wasn't that interested in doing it. You know, she's actually a Colombian actress, but yeah, that was yeah. You have to be respectful as an ADR supervisor, I guess, of the actors and actresses, and make sure that, you know, they feel comfortable. Which I guess how is, like, as an ADR supervisor, like as a sound supervisor, how important is that too? Speaking of collaboration, of your relationship with the actors and making sure, you know, because when it's different to be in a film set with costumes, with your other actor, with, you know, your co-star in front of you, in the mood, in the thing, versus just being in an ADR stage, looking at a screen and looking at a script. And you know, how do you create that environment so that you get the right performances?
This is a great question. I'm really glad you asked it, because I actually wanted to talk about this and I completely forgot to put it in the presentation. This is a huge, sometimes intangible aspect to being a supervising sound editor or an ADR supervisor, if that is indeed a separate job on the project, is you have to work directly with actors, or talent as we call them. And that's not always easy. Actors, for the most part, my experience has been that they've been very professional. They're very nice. They're very grateful that you're doing all of this hard work to make them look and sound better. But it's also not an easy thing for them, for an actor to have to come into a cold, sterile studio months after they shot the scene in question, and have to suddenly, come up with all of that emotion and that performance, and be expected to do it in a moment's notice. Here are the lines. Here's what we need. Action. And that's, there's a reason most actors hate ADR, and that's one of the reasons. Is it's not that easy to do for them, and they're never, unless you're Meryl Streep, probably not going to feel like you've really nailed the original performance in a way that you're not going to be sorry that that's going to be what's in the final product. So one of the ways in which I'm glad I am also an actor is this very nature of the relationship, is that I have found that as an actor, and having had experience as an actor and having been trained as an actor, I can talk to another actor in their language. And this has been really hugely beneficial for me in my job. I can usually immediately put them at ease. They feel as though they have an ally in the room. They feel as though that there's someone that understands how hard it is, what they're doing, etc. And the other thing that can be difficult is, unless you've got the director of the project, who normally does show up to ADR sessions, but not always, especially in TV, and TV never. Unless the director is there to direct the actor, it's going to fall on you to get what you need out of that actor for the job. And so you not only need to know how to talk to an actor, you actually need to know how to direct an actor without insulting them, without intimidating them, without pissing them off, without, shutting them down, because that would be the worst case scenario. So yeah, this is a tricky little thing that's good to remember about working with actors on an ADR stage, is it's a delicate relationship that has to be earned, if that makes sense. So if you're a relatively young, inexperienced supervisor going in to shoot ADR, record ADR with an actor for the first or second or third time in your career, go in knowing that you're going to want to be as respectful as possible to the actor. You're going to want to be very understanding and empathetic and sympathetic to that actor about what they have to do, and kind of stroke them a bit, as we say. There's no shame in it. You're gonna need to do what you need to do to get that performance out of that actor, and to keep that actor from shutting down on you. Because I've had that happen too. I've had actors that have decided, well, fuck this guy. I'm not working with this guy. I'm not giving him what he wants. And they'll basically blow up the session, and you won't get anything that you need, and you'll have to figure out where to go from there. And that could be a real sticky, political nightmare for you. If you've got the director there, you're generally off the hook for having to worry about that stuff, because it'll be the director's job at that point to handle his talent. It'll be up to you, though, to be sure that you get what you need. You're going to have to be paying attention to sync. You're going to have to be paying attention to performance, and you're going to have to be paying attention to the technical aspect of the sound of their voice and how it's matching the timbre of the voice of that actor on the day that they were shooting. So you have to keep all of those things in mind each time they do a take, and you evaluate whether or not that take is good enough. Because sometimes you'll have the actor go, "Ooh, I nailed it, that was great." Or you'll have the director go, "Terrific, let's move on." But you'll have to be the person to say, "Hang on just a second, let me make sure this is right. Otherwise, I'll never get another shot at it. And that's another thing to remember about ADR is generally you get one shot at each actor. There is nothing a producer likes less than bringing an actor back in a second time for ADR. So I see Andre's shaking his head.
Right.
You do not want to be the reason for that.
Right.
So anyway, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That's a really good thing to talk a little bit about, because it's never taught. It is not something that ever gets taught to you if you're a sound editor getting into dialogue in ADR supervision, where you're going to have to actually be in an ADR session. So
amazing.
Yeah. Let's see. I think we're trying to wrap up collaboration here. Sound editorial and re-recording mixers. This is something that again is overlooked quite a bit, I think. When I come onto a project, one of the first things I want to do is know who the mixers are going to be, and reach out and get a feel for, if I don't know them, how they like sound delivered to the stage, how they work. There are a bunch of things you can talk about with the mixer as the sound supervisor or sound designer or sound editor that'll be really helpful down the road in order to deliver a session that the mixer is going to really like working with. It's going to be efficient. That's going to be, laid out in a way that's going to save him time and the production time. And, that includes talking about layout, but also even asking for a template. A lot of mixers these days will keep a template of the session the way they like it set up. And so if you get a template of that session, you can literally work in that session and deliver it back to the mixers in exactly the way they like it. And this will make your mixers happy and save your producers time in the mix and leave more time for doing more fun stuff in the mix, as opposed to the less fun stuff involving mixers moving things around and importing things into their sessions. And, sometimes a mixer can spend an hour or two in setup if something's not delivered the way that they're used to working with. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. And also talking about a mixing plan. It's never too early to talk about the style of how you're going to mix, the order that you're going to mix in, how you're going to use all of that mix time, how you're going to divide it up. If you have a plan early on, even if you end up changing it down the road, it's going to be helpful, I think, as part of that collaboration. Next thing that I'd love to talk about is storytelling, unless anybody has any questions about the last thing.
I don't believe so. I think we're good to move on. Yeah.
As it says, the main thing I want to say about storytelling as a sound supervisor and sound designer is to never forget that it's all about the story. It is, at the end of the day, all about telling a story. Every single person involved in making a film is involved in the service of telling a story. And that story starts with the script. And so when I'm talking to young up and coming sound editors and sound designers and supervisors about this craft, I talk about script writing, because it is never too early to use sound as a storytelling tool. And I will show you an example of that in a moment. And the other thing that I urge sound editors and designers and supervisors to do is to read the script. Get your hands on the script as early as possible, the moment you have the gig. Often you'll be able to get a script before you get the gig, because they'll want to know whether or not you've done a little research before an interview, perhaps. And you're going to want to know as much about it as you can. And the script is the place to start. It's never too early to begin the sound design process for a film. If you have the script, you can do this before they've even shot a frame of it, or regardless of where they're at in the process. If you've got the script, you can start working on that project immediately. I always suggest also read the script and bring your own ideas to the table. Analyze the script for sound design opportunities and ideas. Articulate how these ideas will help tell and enhance the story to the filmmakers, and you may become their new best friend as their sound supervisor. Here is an example that I love. It's actually a young gentleman, a first-time director that I worked with 5 or 6 years ago. And he sent me the script with some notes of his own. You see the notes in green of his. And then the notes in red were my notes back to him. I wish I could make this a little bigger. Wonder how to do that. There we go. So you'll see we have scene 1, exterior New York City. There's some descriptive stuff about the pale morning light and some sculptures and some things happening on the street. And he says to me in his note, want this to feel a bit unsettling and transition to the next scene, saying things are not all right. So that was his note to me. So I said, after thinking about it, I imagine this opening being scored with very sparse music and only a hint of surreal dreamlike representation of early morning New York City sounds. And as the main character wakes up, we hear the sounds of the city transition from dreamlike to real, as though the sounds are retracted like the light through his window, because you'll see as this character wakes up, what's going to be happening is that there's going to be a shot with a little refracted light through his window. And so that's just an example of going through a script and having a little back and forth with the director screenwriter about sound. And this was many, many, many months before he even started shooting that we started having these conversations. And in fact, he rewrote another draft of the script that then included all of the sound conversations we have. And you'll see that I made some suggestions. Perhaps this sound transition continues to evolve and actually resolves hard cut with the sound of the toothbrush coming on as we cut to this character brushing his teeth in the bathroom. And he says, love the hard cut, love the idea of doing it as a hard cut. And then I make a further suggestion. Maybe the sound of the toothbrush actually morphs into the pre-lap sound of subway, because the next scene happens in a subway. Could be interesting, just playing around with some ideas. We ended up actually doing that in the final mix, and he loved it. So that is an example of getting involved early on with a script. Any questions about that?
And I'll add to that, the one great thing about doing it at the stage of the script, and you can see it in that example that you just showed us, you are at that point, helping to create sound ideas into the editorial, into the cut itself, right? So like when you have
exactly
sound concepts that need sort of like a picture attached to those sound concepts that really sell them, when you work in that way, it's a really great example how the actual cut can be, affected in a way so that you know what's coming, and this idea from inception comes from the sound department.
Well, naturally, when they had shot and they were in the editing room putting the picture together, I was asked, of course, to give them some temp mocked up versions of this idea, and that is where the sound design continued to evolve. There was a little back and forth there. They, oh, I love this, but I don't so much love this. Can we try this? And again, back and forth. And yes, it is time consuming, but it's really the part of the work that is the most gratifying in a way, when you are working directly with a filmmaker to help tell his story, and he is respecting your craft to the point where he's recognized that it's a major part of the process. And that is exactly where you want to be. Where you don't want to be is to be considered a technical finishing part of the process, where there's very little creative collaboration going on. For me, the fun is in the creative collaboration. I mean, I consider myself a filmmaker as a sound designer. So that's where the fun stuff happens. And it's only going to happen if you are proactive about creating that collaboration early on, is the point.
Right. Inserting yourself in the conversation to some extent.
Exactly. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, if they don't want you there, they'll tell you. But I have never found that to be the case. You know, unless it's a TV show where, you know, it's a completely different vibe. And we can talk about the difference between film and television when we're done with this. For the purposes of not having this be, you know, 1,000 slides long, I've kept it to film for this particular presentation. Next concept to talk about is using sound to create mood and emotion. I've always felt good sound design can create a mood or evoke an emotion in subtle, often subliminal ways. And in many cases, sound design can be as or even more effective than music when trying to color a scene or a moment without being overt or heavy-handed, which is sometimes difficult to do when you're relying on music. Sometimes the music can't help but be overt or heavy-handed because it's the nature of what it's doing with an established melody and you know, something that's been orchestrated. It's hard to be subliminal or you know, subtle enough to not be heavy-handed is my point, I guess. Some basic examples, and these are very basic. Obviously, it can get a lot more intricate and layered, but you can use insects to create intensity in a scene, and or heat as in temperature. You know, if you have a location that's in the deep south, for instance, you're probably going to be married to a lot of insects anyway on your production sound. But you know, you're gonna also then learn to embrace that. You know, you're going to use probably even more insects. You're going to work really hard to get them out of the production, but then you're going to work really hard to put them back into your mix because it's a part of the environment. And it could very well also be a part of the mood that you're trying to create. You know, the right type of insect sound can be really intense and can create a lot of tension if used correctly. It can create a rhythm to a scene. And of course, it can also communicate extreme heat. And you know, something that sounds hot will very adequately communicate that in a story, in a film, in a shot, in a scene. Obviously, the sight of the actor sweating profusely will help, but in a lot of cases, sound is called upon to create an environment that didn't actually exist at the time. You know, you could have a scenario where a scene was shot in a practically cold environment, but was meant to not be cold in the story. And so you're actually going to have to help tell that story with sound. You're going to have to make it sound hot. And the same can be true in the reverse. Whistly wind, for instance, can communicate cold temperature, or isolation can make something feel very isolated, lonely. A certain type of bird song can create a happy, joyful mood. But a certain type of bird could also create an ominous vibe, you know, the distant sound of a hawk screeching, or you know, the sound of a loon at night can be very haunting. A grandfather clock tick can establish a feeling of opulence on a set, you know, that's meant to feel that way, feel very opulent and rich and refined. You know, there's nothing does that better than an old grandfather clock ticking in the distance. A distant siren can create a feeling of danger, of you know, danger on the horizon, danger coming. Can create the feeling of a seedy neighborhood along with a car alarm going off, or you know, the sound of distant voices shouting. You know, stuff like that can really help set a mood and create emotion purely from sound, if that makes sense.
Perfect sense.
Sound design versus music. when I was first coming up in this industry, it was just a running joke that, we would get to the mix, not having really heard any of the final music, and, working really hard on building out the soundtrack. And it would ultimately become a contest on the mixing stage between the music and the sound effects. And I have spent a lot of my career fighting against this phenomenon. I don't believe it needs to be a contest. I think that the best final mixes are true collaboration between sound design and music. And the collaboration can and should start early. So the composer and the supervising sound editor / sound designer can share preliminary versions of their work with each other. This can lead to new ideas for each of them. Adjustments can be made to accommodate each discipline. Adjustments that involve pitch, for instance, or timing of hits. And there can be some give and take. There can be a conversation about music taking over in one section and then giving away in another section and making room for the sound design, which is being discussed as important for that moment. And that is really valuable collaboration when it comes to mixing, because if all of that stuff is done in advance, you're not going to end up wasting time having music and sound effects fight each other or making choices between them. You're already going to have a situation where they're working well together. Does that make sense?
Perfect sense.
This is another thing that I would say, always try to do this. Always try to reach out to the composer on the project you're working on and establish a relationship early on with that composer that's not adversarial and that aims to create, not just a practical collaboration to make things more efficient down the road, but a true creative collaboration as well. All right. Lastly, on this section of the presentation, I want to talk a little bit about communication, the language of sound design. We talked a little bit about terminology early on. There is so much more terminology than would occur to me to put into this presentation or that we have time to really talk about. I mean, you could find online glossaries of sound design terms and have enough reading material for days. But the point is that it's important to remember that, especially new directors and producers that come into your life as a sound designer and supervisor, you're probably going to need to work a little harder than you normally do to create that understanding, to establish that language, to make sure that you guys are on the same page. A lot of people that have never gone through the post-production sound process have never heard a lot of these terms or have heard them but don't really know what they mean. So it's important to remember they may not understand common post-production sound terminology, so don't assume. Make sure there's a mutual understanding around the language used when talking about sound on every level. And the other thing to remember is that they actually also may not be able to articulate their vision for sound design to you because they've never had to. And it's not that they don't understand that sound will be a big part of their project, but they may never have had this conversation where they're talking to a sound designer about what they're trying to achieve. And so that language might take a little bit of time to develop. And I believe that it's a supervising sound editor or sound designer's job to listen to what that vision is, interpret it, confirm it, and then contribute to it as well with your own ideas. But again, none of this is possible without a common language. And so that's important to remember and understand and work towards having with a client that's not as experienced with post-production sound. All right. If nobody has any specific questions about any of that, we can move on to the process workflow part of the program.
There was a question a little bit more when you were talking about, setting a place and setting a mood. Give me 1 second. Basically, the question says, what strategies could you use in the case of animation when you don't necessarily have a visual reference that's as clear, and where you have more freedom as a sound designer?
Yeah, it's both a blessing and a curse at the same time,
Right.
in my mind. It's always a blessing as a sound designer to have sort of a blank slate to work from, in a way, and which animation offers, because the only thing you're going to have to work with, or that is going to be added, is the voices. Otherwise, it's a blank slate for you. Yes, you're going to have visual cues, but when you have to start actually working, might actually be earlier than those visuals are fully formed. So you do have to use your imagination, but it's a great opportunity. It's a great opportunity to actually contribute to the storytelling as a sound designer with animation. Sorry, the specific question was about what do you do in terms of the mood?
Yeah, what strategies would you use to find that mood? Like, so basically, I think what
when you don't have a visual cue for it, in other words.
Exactly, how do you find that kind of that storytelling vision?
I go back to the script portion of where we talked about reading the script, understanding the story, understanding what the filmmaker is trying to accomplish in that story. So I think it requires an analysis of the script. It requires a little bit of your own creative contribution to offer up some ideas. But the script will give you the clues you need in terms of the mood you want to create. And then it is sort of it is sort of a wide open canvas you have to work with to create it. But the secondary part of that is checking in with the filmmakers, with the director, the animators, whoever you're interacting directly with in that process, and have that conversation. So if you have a question in your mind about the mood or the vibe of a scene in a location where you have no visual cues, you're just going to have that conversation. You have to go off the script. And if you have questions like, how dark do we want this to be, if at all? Do we want it to feel dangerous? Do we want it to feel lonely for the character? Do we want it to feel chaotic? And so those are words that then should cue ideas on your end as to what to put in the sound. Does that make sense?
Perfect sense. I think so.
Okay.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you. All right, let's talk a little bit about workflow. I'm starting with pre-production because I like to start early on a project, as you've heard. Like I said, get your hands on that script. The project starts for you as a supervising sound editor and sound designer with script analysis. You're going to get the script, you're going to read it, maybe more than once, and you're going to understand the story. And then you're going to start looking for specific things that are clues to what the sound job is going to encompass. So that's going to be the various locations, the various situations. Are there chase scenes? Are there murder scenes? Are there fights? Are there montages, love scenes, whatever they might be? Are there, children involved? Are there playgrounds? Are there scenes on an airplane? Are there scenes in a car? All of those things are going to inform you in terms of what you're going to need to plan for in the sound job. And the other thing you can do when reading a script is you can, if you're experienced enough or have a good enough imagination, you can flag potential sound problems that you can see down the road because of a way a scene is constructed in the script. For instance, let's say you've got a scene that involves some live music. And so there's playback, there's your character up on stage pretending to sing against the playback, perhaps. And you've got a lot of different moving parts in this scene, but one thing you're going to have to probably contend with is replacing all the sound, because there's going to be a playback situation. It's just one example of many. It's one that I can just think of off the top of my head, if it makes sense. Next step in the workflow process will be the production sound. I like to say, if you haven't shot your film yet, it begins before you shoot by selecting the finest production dialogue mixer you can afford. A little bit of extra paid to a great production mixer can save you tenfold later in post-production. Let me repeat this to the producers that are listening. If you haven't shot your film yet, it begins before you shoot by selecting the finest production dialogue mixer you can afford. I can't stress this enough, as a person that's worked on over 150 films and projects, that a good production dialogue mixer on set is worth his weight in gold. And the really, really good ones will be a pain in your director's ass. They'll say that right off the bat, because they're going to let you know when there's a problem. And usually the last person you want to hear from when you're on a set trying to make a schedule, trying to get that shot before you lose the light, is a pesky production sound mixer telling you that there's a problem. You're going to ignore it and you're going to say the famous words, "We'll fix it in post." Well, it's not always that easy. So my opinion is, you can't spend too much time and effort finding the right person for this position. It's an often overlooked position on a film set, and it's more important than you know, unless you've been through it. So if you've been through it, you know what I'm talking about.
I really want to just kind of stress that point. Just I have nothing to add other than, like, that might be the single most important decision of your film, of the sound of the film, is choosing a really good sound mixer that knows what they're doing. Production sound mixer, because the time that you will save, I mean, everything you just said, but I just want to stress it because it is so important, and what you've been saying, when you spend time actually making creative decisions, creative choices, versus trying to clean up somebody else's mess, your movie's just going to be better. It's just that. Exactly. But sorry,
it has a snowball effect, because not only will it cost you more money in the amount of time you spend ADRing and editing and mixing, but your actors aren't going to be too happy either, because they're going to have to come in and do a lot of lines that they're simply not going to want to do. In most cases, they're probably never going to make it as good as the original. There's a domino effect that will continue to cause pain all the way through to the end of the process. And it's a very underappreciated craft that not a lot of people do well for some reason. It's not that easy to find a person that has a knack for it. And also a person that's willing to speak up, because, like I said, the best production sound mixers are the ones that are often considered a pain in the ass on the day, because they're getting in your way, but they're getting in your way for a good reason. Picture editors' tracks. I'd like to suggest that you, as a sound supervisor, sound designer, offer to supply temp sound effects to the picture editor. It can be mutually beneficial to supply the picture editor with quality sound effects for their edit, a chance for early collaboration and experimentation to see what works and what doesn't work. And there will inevitably be what we call temp love, a term that means if you don't know, that they have heard a sound so much in the edit room and have fallen in love with it so much that it's going to live in your mix no matter how you feel about it, because they have temp love. They've gotten used to it. They love it. They can't imagine it being any different, so you'd better not change it. That's what we call temp love in post sound. It's not always a good thing. So my opinion is it's better if that temp love is at least with your quality sounds that you've supplied to the picture editor in part. Next part of the process that you will need to be concerned about is called spotting. Once the cut has been locked or is close enough to get together and discuss all things sound on a film, the film can be spotted for the placement of sound effects and music. The supervising sound editor, the director, the film editor, and possibly the composer. I say possibly because sometimes music is spotted separately from sound. It all depends on people's schedules, the time that you want to spend in a little room with a lot of people talking about the sound. Sometimes it's a little easier to split it up. I like doing it with the composer because often there are things discussed that do overlap, that are useful to have both the composer and the supervising sound editor in the same room for. Anyway, all these people will gather at one or more spotting sessions to determine the film's audio post needs. Spotting the music is the process of viewing the lock cut and deciding where the music score will be. Sometimes it can be a completely different thing than spotting sound, and so it's fine if it's a separate session. Where source music will be needed, etc. Spotting for sound specifically is the process of determining, one, if and where any dialogue problems may exist so that ADR can be cued and recorded. And that doesn't include just problems, that also includes story and telling enhancements like added lines or line changes to fix an edit where you've shortened a scene significantly. You might need an extra line of dialogue that's new, that's different than what you shot on the day to help make that happen editorially, for instance. 2, where sound effects are needed and what kind. 3, what Foley effects will be needed in the film and where. That's not always something that gets discussed in a spotting session. Foley is one of those things that's sort of taken for granted that will, fully cover the project with Foley wherever it's needed. Not generally something that is creatively discussed in a spotting session, but it is part of the process. And lastly, if sound design and the creation of special sound effects will also be needed and where. Spotting sessions are great also, in my mind, because it's an invaluable opportunity for the supervising sound editor and or sound designer to discuss creative goals and directions with the filmmakers directly and suggest ideas to a very captive audience because they're all trapped in a room watching the same thing. So I always look at those as really good opportunities for doing my job well, as opposed to a pain in the ass, for instance. And it could end up turning into a pain in the ass, and it could be grueling. It depends on the crowd you're working with. I've worked with directors and picture editors and producers that have wanted to belabor every frame of film and talk about it. And so spotting sessions can last for days for an entire film. And I've been in spotting sessions where the opposite is true. And everybody understands that you don't talk about the obvious stuff. You focus on the important stuff and you blast through it. I've seen it both ways and everything in between. So it all depends on the crowd you're working with. So be prepared for any of those scenarios. What happens after spotting? Good question, Jay. The real job of audio post begins at this point. So in the next weeks or months, depending on the schedule and the scope of the project, the sound editors will locate and synchronize all the sound effects needed in the film. If necessary, they'll create field recordings of new sound effects needed for the film where they fall short in their sound effects libraries. The Foley supervisor will cue all of the Foley effects that will be needed, and they will be recorded by the Foley mixer and the Foley walkers, as discussed earlier. The ADR supervisor will cue all the automated dialogue replacement lines that need to be recorded during the ADR sessions. And I can interject a little bit there in terms of technology. Again, this was something that we used to do with actual paper cue sheets. Now we have lots of good software out there that enables you to create the clips of ADR lines and of Foley cues, for instance, in a Pro Tools session and export them in any number of ways. My favorite program is called EdiQ, which is made by a company called Sounds and Sync. You can Google that if you like. It's not cheap, but if you do a lot of this work, you rely on software like this to help make that work not only efficient, but to enable you to collaborate with ADR stages more easily, because a lot of them use the same software as well. And so rather than spend time, creating and sending PDF cue sheets, which you'll do anyway for the actors, but you can also send the sessions themselves to a lot of ADR stages that'll make their jobs a lot easier to set those sessions up and record the ADR very efficiently.
I'll add another recommendation to that software because it's actually free, and I mean, it's definitely not as good as EdiQ, and it's not as robust, but it'll get you out of a pinch. Is PGPT Sessions? I don't know if you're Pete Gates Pro Tools Sessions. It's called, and
I'm not familiar.
It's this guy, and it's just like a one guy that does it, and it's pretty. Again, it's not nearly as robust as EdiQ, but it will read your Pro Tools session. It will create your cues for both ADR and music cue sheets. It's
well, there you go. Free is always good if it works.
It'll work, yeah. I just yeah.
Yeah, I mean there are many different degrees of cost and features that you can explore. If it does the job that needs to be done, whatever works. Also, one of my mottos. So personally, I love EdiQ because of the flexibility, because of all the things you can do, all the different ways you can create layouts for the PDF sheets, and save those layouts.
I'll say if you can afford it, definitly do EdiQ. It's
a
lot better.
Yeah. But it is, I guess, it's a few $100, right?
But it's But when working in Colombia with Colombian budgets and Colombian, it's a few $100 is a different thing there than it is here, for sure.
I hear you, brother. I hear you.
Say.
The dialogue editor or editors will begin preparing the production audio for final mixing. We talked a little bit about that and what that entails. And the ADR editors can commence editing in the ADR lines once they have been recorded. And again, these aren't always done by different people or departments. Sometimes it's the supervising sound editor himself that will handle all the ADR. Sometimes the dialogue editors will be given the recorded ADR and they'll cut it in with the dialogue and make it all work. So there's no one way to do it. It'll all depend on what is best in your particular situation, your particular project. Maybe you're a one-man show. Maybe you're doing it all, in which case, the workflow applies only to you. That's fine too. And lastly, the music editor will begin providing for the needs of the composer and or the music supervisor. Now, we haven't talked a lot about the role of music in post-production sound. Even though music plays a huge part, obviously, in the soundtrack and the final mix, it is generally one of those things that's done entirely separately from post-production sound. The composer generally has a music editor that they like to work with, that basically looks out for them and their music and their compositions, shepherds their tracks through post by not only just editing it into place, but also being the eyes and ears of the composer at a mix and helping to sort of direct everybody else in the room as to how the music is supposed to work in the mix. That makes sense. That is generally the music editor that does that stuff. Composers aren't usually invited to the mix. They may be invited to playbacks. and invited to not take notes, but it has not been my experience that composers have sat in on mixes. That generally doesn't end up being very efficient. Sorry. Continuing with what happens after spotting, typically the next few weeks or months are occupied with sound editing of all types, as we discussed. Another thing that happens very often on bigger projects is that the director, not even just big projects, sometimes small ones as well, the director may be checking in on the various aspects of the sound job as time progresses to be sure that his vision is being realized. Usually there is a provision for one or more sound effects reviews, we call them, where the effects are listened to and approved. Not in the context of the final mix, obviously, because everything is still a work in progress, but what's asked is for the director and maybe sometimes the picture editor and sometimes the producers as well to review what's been done so far to make sure that everybody's on the right track creatively and that everything is being considered that they want considered. Now, when everything is completed and approved, the next step is mixing, also called dubbing or re-recording mixing. All three of those are used fairly commonly. On larger film projects, the mixers will pre-mix or pre-dub the various elements without clients in the room. Often the mixers will do this on their own in different smaller mix environments, sometimes simultaneously in different rooms if the schedule dictates that. But that is where the dialogue mixer will work on just the dialogue tracks and work on cleaning them up and equalizing them and making them sound as clean and smooth as possible. Of course, it's a little out of context because he's not working with all the other sounds that are ultimately going to go into it, but it does save a lot of final mix time to do this in advance. There's a lot of tedious, monotonous things that happen when you're mixing dialogue that are better left to the dialogue mixer alone in a room, quite honestly. Instead of a final mix where you've got people that are hoping to spend that time doing more creative things than, listening to a line over and over again 20 times while the dialogue mixer EQs it or matches a bit of ADR. Does that make sense? Also, when it comes to pre-mixing sound effects, again, if it's a very big action-packed movie, there are going to be scenes that are going to take an enormous amount of time to wrangle in terms of the hundreds, maybe thousands of tracks of sound effects and sound design that are being supplied. And so the pre-mixing helps the mixer get everything recorded down to what we call stems, so that he's working mostly with groups of sound effects rather than hundreds and hundreds of individual sound effects, which can be really cumbersome and tedious when you are trying to accomplish a final mix with all of the filmmakers in a room and you've got a limited amount of time. You don't want to be sifting through hundreds of tracks looking for something. You want to sort of sort all that out on your own beforehand, and we call that pre-mixing. What happens at the mix? During the mix, the edited production dialogue and ADR, sound effects, Foley, musical elements, everything that will comprise the soundtrack are assembled in their edited form and balanced by a number of mixers to become the final soundtrack. In New York, single mixer sessions are more commonplaces than in Hollywood, where 2 mixer and 3 mixer teams are the norm. Talked a little bit about that earlier in the definition of mixers. The mixers traditionally divide the chores between themselves. The 2-man team, in that case, the effects mixer will handle, the lead mixer usually handles dialogue and ADR and may also handle music in a 2-man team. In that case, the effects mixer will handle sound effects and Foley. In 3-man teams, they usually split dialogue, effects, and music into those 3 mixers. Sometimes the music mixer will handle Foley, sometimes the effects mixer covers it, but you get the idea, is that each mixer is charged with handling a big piece of it, because for some reason, the way things have evolved in Hollywood, at least, that has been the norm. That has been the way to get through big movies, is to have 3 different people at the console at the same time. because there's a lot to handle. To keep the mix from becoming overwhelming, each mixer is actually creating a small set of individual submixes called stems. These mix stems, dialogue, effects, Foley, music, ads, extras, etc., are easier to manipulate and update during and after the mix and are a standard part of a final delivery. So if you hear the word stem, that's what that refers to, is all of the dialogue mixed into a 5.1 channel stem usually, or a couple of different stems if things need to be separated out. Or 7.1 stems, depending on the format that you're working in. Next up is playback. When a first pass of mixing is completed, there is usually a playback of the mix for the director, the picture editor, the producer, whoever is invited. Notes are taken and discussed after that playback. Then you do fixes. Sometimes the director, picture editor, producer, sometimes they don't always stay for the fixes. They'll leave their notes and they'll get on with their days, and you'll go through them and execute them all. All pertinent notes are executed by the mixers. Any additional materials needed for a fix are supplied by the supervising sound editor and his team. There will be additional playbacks and fixes as needed and as are allowed by time or schedule or budget. Obviously, mix time's very expensive. It's one of the most expensive parts of the process. So unless you've got a big budget, you're probably not going to be doing a whole lot of these playbacks. But you know, as these additional playbacks and fixes are accomplished and it's decided that that's it, we're done, you are going to do something called print master. Films generally require this last step before shipping. It combines the various stems into a final composite soundtrack. You can hear all the stems back in a playback, and that's what it's supposed to sound like, but you actually need to do one more step, which is print them all into the various formats that are going to get delivered. Often print masters are done in 2 steps for really big projects with budgets. The multi-track format will be done as one print master, and then the stereo crashdown will be done as a separate. The reason we do this on big action films is that sometimes with the stereo crashdown, it's not just a transfer, it requires some additional tweaking and mixing to make the stereo work best. But often in smaller scope projects or lower budget projects, all of the various formats are print mastered at once into the same session, and perhaps spot checked as a quality control thing after the fact, but not played back in real time on the stage. Depends on the size of the project and the budget usually. Deliverables, speaking of which, the standard mix formats are stereo, 5.1, 7.1, which involves obviously a couple of additional speakers in the front and the back, and Dolby Atmos, which is the most advanced film mixing format, which involves many, many speakers placed all over the room, which gives you a full feeling of immersion in the sound. Andres, you could speak to this. I don't know how far along Dolby Atmos is in Colombia at the moment, whether you guys are, you know, it's become a standard down there, or?
It is very far from becoming a standard. We actually just finished setting up our studio here as an Atmos studio.
Oh, cool.
I'm not sure. I don't want to affirm this for sure, but we might be one of the first, if not the first, like actual monitoring Atmos rooms. So, you know, it's very, very early stages, but, you know, we're at 1,000 birds. We're definitely, you know, trying to get it going down here for sure.
Well, the name certainly suggests, you know, a lot of different sounds.
Right. A lot of sound sources. That's right.
You know, the idea with Atmos is the mixing stage is set up with speakers, not just the standard left, center, right, left surround, right surround, and perhaps additional left center, right center speakers As well, it also includes speakers on the ceiling and throughout the stage. And as you're mixing, the mixers can actually place sounds in those specific speakers or pan them throughout an array of speakers in any which way that they like. It's pretty advanced matrix, works like a charm though, sounds amazing in a movie theater and on the mixing stage. And most of the projects that we're working on at Formosa at the moment, even the TV shows, are mixing in Atmos now, because there is home Atmos. Not a whole lot of people are lucky enough to have it, but it does exist. So, you know, we mix it that way now, so that when everybody has home Atmos, it's already mixed that way.
I believe Netflix, I'm not sure if Amazon, but I know for a fact that Netflix now requires it as a required deliverable. I think for Colombian content, I think there's a waiver, but generally speaking, internationally, at least in the US, it's now a required deliverable. So everything that goes to Netflix, in theory, should have a Dolby Atmos mix.
Which makes sense. I mean, my experience with Netflix is that they want absolutely every possible scenario covered. They do an awful lot of international stuff. It's one of the reasons I think Dynasty keeps getting renewed. I don't think it's because people are watching it on the CW here in the States in large numbers. I think it's because it's got a huge following internationally, where Netflix owns all of those rights. So that must be the reason. M&E, which stands for Music and Effects. This is essentially the film soundtrack with the main language dialogue removed. So if we're working on an M&E in the States and it's in English, then all the English has been removed. Maybe some of the other languages that are an essential part of the story stay as is. Maybe they get separated out as well, and we leave it up to whatever country is overdubbing it into their language. Whatever might be the case, language in general needs to be removed, and it allows the foreign language versions of the project to be dubbed easily while preserving the original music, sound effects, and Foley. During the M&E, effects and Foley that are married to the production dialogue, you know, for instance, if a person is speaking and, let's say, shuffling some cards at the same time, and that sound is married to the dialogue, and the filmmakers decided that was fine. For the M&E, that card shuffling is going to have to be covered by Foley or sound effects, and when the dialogue's removed, that sound will be removed as well and have to be replaced with Foley or sound effects. So that's what we mean by fully filled. The most common scenario is that we don't pick and choose what to cover with Foley and sound effects. We, right off the bat, assume that there's going to be an M&E, and so we fully fill it right off the bat. It's simply part of the job, part of the expected deliverable. That may not always be the case with a really low budget indie film that might be scraping together every penny they can to finish. That might be the type of thing that happens after the film gets sold. As a necessity, usually when a film is sold, the distributor will require an M&E, and so that'll have to be gone back in and covered. It's always a little more expensive to do it after the fact, though, so we try to do that during the course of the regular prep. Television version. This is becoming less and less common as broadcast television seems to start to evaporate. But if you are doing let's say a rated R movie, for instance, probably the best example, that has a lot of cursing in it, or a lot of nudity that needs to be visually taken out, you're going to have a television version of the project to do. And from a sound standpoint, you'll probably have to do some conforming of a new edit that will have removed some visually graphic things, but you'll also have to have recorded TV versions of profanity that existed in the original film. And so if you're programming ADR for that film and you know you have to do a television version, you're going to program all of the curse words with television adequate replacements. And that is if the decision is to not simply bleep it out or have a hole. Some filmmakers decide they'd rather do that than stick a silly word in place of a bad one. So if a television version is required, ADR will have to be recorded clean. Clean versions of the lines that can contain profanity not acceptable on broadcast television. And as a separate mix, after all of the other mixing is done, you do a separate television mix where you put those clean ADR lines in, and you mix to possibly a different version of picture as well if there was visual things that need to be removed. So if somebody says to you, as part of a deliverable, they need a television version, you know what that means. Gonna talk a little bit about technique. As I know, I've now talked for a whole lot of time, and I want to leave enough time for some questions and answers. But some sound editorial basics, some do's and don'ts. One thing to remember in the feature world is that the editor's track should be treated as "quote unquote" the Bible, meaning it's the blueprint. It's sort of a sacred thing to not be messed with unless you specifically check in with the filmmakers about that. But assume that what the editor has spent time putting in his track, at least in a feature film setting, is what you should be following very closely. And if there's a question as to whether or not something needs to be changed or replaced technically, and it changes something that the editor did, that's a conversation that needs to happen, rather than just going ahead and doing it and having the editor be on the mix stage and say, where's the take I put in there? That's not the take I used. Then you'd be in trouble at that point. So big thing to remember about editors' tracks. Don't work in a vacuum. This sort of goes along with the whole collaboration thing. There really are no vacuums to work in the filmmaking process. Everything is collaborative. Everything is serving the story. So there is no such thing in my mind as working in a vacuum. If you're serving the story, you're collaborating with the other storytellers on a project. That's just a sort of a general way that I feel about it. Be specific. This is something that I've learned over many years of doing this, that more is not necessarily better. That specificity is a really good general discipline to follow, is to be as specific as possible for a number of reasons. One of which is if you give the mixer too many things to play at once, you're creating more work than is necessary for the mixer. You're also leaving maybe a little too much up to the mixer to decide. Be specific about what you want as the sound designer and supervising sound editor, unless it's a situation where you've been asked to offer options. Otherwise, my opinion about options is that they're not generally good unless they're really needed or asked for. Go for it. If you're wrong, if you miss the target creatively, there's nothing wrong with that. But you're better off, in my opinion, making a strong choice and being specific about something creatively than, offering up 10 different elements for something that didn't need 10 different elements. That just basically turns into mush when you're done mixing them all together and has no definition. Attention to detail. There's a lot of detail involved in post-production sound. And a large part of doing it well is paying attention to all that detail. Some of it is tedious. Some of it's not very sexy. Some of it may not seem creative, but at the end of the day, it is important. It is important to dot your I's and cross your T's, as we say, which basically means pay attention to the detail. God is in the details. All those cliches, they're as true as ever in post-production sound. Communicate and follow through. Don't assume anything and ask questions. These three things go together. I don't think there's any such thing as a dumb question. If you ever are accused of asking a dumb question in this process, then there's something wrong with the other person accusing you of that, because there is no such thing. You never want to make assumptions about things, either creatively or practically, when it comes to doing this type of work. You want to always be on the same page with the filmmakers that you are working with and for. And so communication is key. Following through, if things don't get resolved at first, just keep following through. I know a lot of people will have the instinct to not be a pain in the ass, and you don't want to be a pain in the ass, certainly, but part of your job is making sure that you know exactly what the filmmakers want and that you are on the same page creatively with them. Lastly, layout. This is for you sound editors and supervisors and designers out there. I recommend that you try to think like a mixer. When you're done creating and editing the sounds, your job isn't completely over until you've actually laid them out in a way that is conducive to efficient mixing and leaves as much time as possible for creative work on the stage without bogging down the mixer with doing a lot of tedious stuff because of the way you've laid out your tracks. So again, communicate with the mixer, get a template. If one exists, make sure you know how they like their sound to be delivered to them and what's going to help them most to do their job best. Part of that layout work is thinking about the various sound elements in groups. There are two trains of thought about this when amongst mixers. Some mixers like everything together in one big session that isn't necessarily split up into a lot of different groups, and some like the opposite. Some like all of their straightforward pedestrian type of hard effects like doors and I don't know, doors. Can't think of anything else off the top of my head, but really straightforward sound effects. You know,
car buys or.
Yeah, although cars, sometimes mixers like all their cars and vehicles in a separate pre-dub, separate food group, especially if there's a car chase involved, or there's a lot of the car. But think in what I like to call food groups. You know, think of them as different types of groupings for the effects that would make sense that they're together in a group of tracks for the mixer. But again, this is something you want to establish with the mixer. Always try to strike a balance between simplicity and intricacy. You know, obviously we love detail and we love complexity when it serves the story, but there's a lot to be said for simplicity, which I think also goes along with specificity, in order to create a type of definition with the sound that again serves the story. The more specific you are, the more storytelling you're going to do, in my opinion. If you're very vague and undefined with your sounds, if they're sort of muddled, if there's too much sound going on in a scene where everything together is just getting mushy and sounding like white noise or sounding too loud or overbearing, then you are not serving the story. So whenever you have the opportunity to make choices, make them. Again, I recommend that you not be afraid of being wrong. I think that you're going to get a lot further along as a sound designer and sound editor and supervisor by making really clear, distinct, brave choices, creative choices, as opposed to not making any choices and bringing tons of options and having all that stuff get hashed out while mixing. Just never a good idea. You want to hash out making creative choices before the mix in some back and forth reviewing with the filmmakers. That's fine. But when you get to the mix, you want to be specific. You want to be as simple as you can. The goal is mixing efficiently so that quality time, expensive, valuable mix time is being spent being creative, not doing monotonous things. That's all I have to say about that. The last bit of stuff that I have here, and I guess I can talk to the moderators about how to share some of this stuff with you guys, or I guess it would exist as the YouTube, right, at some point. I have put together a very small sampling, a bit dated. Full disclosure, a lot of this list was made several years ago, so it's not very up to date, and it is in no particular order. But here are some sound designer heroes of mine. Ben Burtt. If you've seen any Star Wars movies, you should know who Ben Burtt is. Also responsible for Raiders of the Lost Ark, WALL-E, all of the new Star Trek movies, etc. He's a legend in our field. If you want to, you can't go wrong looking up interviews with Ben Burtt and reading about Ben Burtt. Walter Murch is another legend in our industry. He's a big-time picture editor, as well as a sound supervisor and sound designer, responsible for editing and sound designing movies like The Conversation, Apocalypse Now, the Godfather movies, etc. Skip Leafsay, an old friend from New York. He was a New York-based supervisor for many years before, I think, also making the move to LA. Yeah, you see the movies listed there. Gary Rydstrom, Randy Tom. These are all legendary sound designers that, again, if you want to Google them and look at their work, you can't go wrong. Ren Kleiss, who does all of Fincher's movies. Dane Davis, who got famous doing the Matrix trilogy. Alan Splett, Frank Warner, etc. Examples of noteworthy sound design. This is, again, a list sort of off the top of my head, but it includes both big, obvious action movies, but also some quiet movies like Shawshank Redemption, which won an Academy Award for sound. Check these movies out, looking at it as a sound designer. There Will Be Blood is another incredible example of kind of a quiet sound design movie that was so powerful, there was hardly any music in it. I added one recent movie that won the Oscar for sound this year, The Sound of Metal. If you haven't seen this movie, I highly recommend it. Not only is it a great movie, but it's a great example of a really good sound job. Obviously, it was not a big budget movie, but boy, they did a terrific job with the sound design in that movie, in my opinion. Well-deserved Oscar for that. Also, check out past Oscar winners for Best Sound Editing and Best Sound. They've recently combined those categories. Unfortunately, they used to be separate. Best Sound Editing was for the post sound. Editorial and Best Sound went to the production mixer and the re-recording mixers together. Obviously, there were some things about that didn't make a whole lot of sense, but now they're all combined into one category. So there you have it. And that's it. That's all I have prepared in this PowerPoint. So, let's do some questions and answers. I'm gonna have to switch mics and headphones. Hang on just a second.
Mientras tanto, mientras Jay hace el cambio ahí, cualquier pregunta, acá tengo unas preguntas de las que han hecho en el chat. Si quieren agregar algo, pues me tocará hacer una selección, pero alguna otra pregunta o duda que les haya quedado, la pueden ir poniendo en el chat y escogeremos algunas que nos dé el tiempo para preguntarle a Jay, y pueden ser en español y yo se las traduzco.
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay, I've got one AirPod that hasn't died yet, and when that one dies, I'll switch over to my speakers and my big old microphone here.
Okay, great.
That's how long I have droned on for.
Okay, amazing. One thing here, let me pull this up. First question I'll bring up. One thing, I guess it's more of a mixed question, but maybe you can tell us from a sound editing perspective how you handle this, and it's about loudness. So the question is, the specific question is, at what moment in the process do you apply the kind of like a loudness
well, you're
standard.
monitoring actual loudness because you have a spec that you have to
Right, exactly. At which point
honor.
do you do this, or like how do you handle this, or
Well, again, this depends on whether you're doing a film for theatrical release or a television show, and even in either of those cases, the standards can vary from studio to studio and from network to network. This is a problem that we have been trying to address for many, many years, and still have not been completely successful at it. But every single network has their own loudness specs for broadcast, and the answer to the question is yes, you do have to honor that. You usually don't do that till the very last part of the mixing process. You'll generally, especially for film, you'll always try to mix at the optimal standard listening level in the studio, which can vary from stage to stage, but you're generally at 85 as the top end decibels, and sometimes you can be as low as the high 70s depending on what the nature of the project is or the room is. Loudness can be all relative, but the idea of mixing is that you always want to mix at the optimal level that you can mix at, so that you're getting as much detail out as possible, and no matter what level it's played at, you'll be having as much of that detail preserved as possible. It doesn't protect it from all of the various things that can happen down the line with broadcast, for instance, all of the mistakes that can happen when something gets played back, all of the compression that it can get run through. You just do your best in the optimal mixing environment, but there are standards. In the TV and commercial world, there's a loudness standard called LKFS. There are professional plugins that we all use now as metering to guarantee that we're hitting those levels. And there are two basic types of loudness standards. One is cumulative, which is a number that you have to hit that takes the entire episode or the entire project all at once, all combined from beginning to end. And then there are standards with broadcast where each act has to hit a certain number. Again, it depends on the network that you're dealing with, the producers, the studio, whatever. But part of the deliverables that you will get as a sound super, not always, because the sound supervisor and the sound designer aren't always responsible for loudness. Generally, it's the mixing stage and the mixers that are responsible for monitoring the loudness, because at the end of the day, they'll control all of that stuff. It's not generally something that we do. So unless you're going to be a mixer, or unless you're a producer, or anything else that needs to be concerned about that, it's not generally something we worry about until the final mix. As we're final mixing, we have those meters up and we're keeping an eye on those to see if we're hitting the number, hitting the standard. And if there are some spots that go over the line of that, where that number needs to stay at, we go back and make tweaks to the mix to get back within the standard. But generally for feature film, especially for theatrical release, the standard is, as loud as you can make it without distorting it, and as loud as what works creatively for you. There aren't really the types of loudness standards for theatrical as there are for broadcast, where you really have to keep your eye on peaking and getting too loud. They have very strict standards for that.
So in those cases, more important than looking at your meters is the fact that wherever you're mixing is a properly calibrated room, so that you know that.
Correct.
Wherever you're.
Which is why you always mix in a real mixing stage, because one of the things that makes it a real stage is that it's been properly calibrated, and that's important. Where periodically people go in there with meters, and you play pink noise, and you make sure that all your speakers are at the right level all the time, so that you're always monitoring it correctly, et cetera, et cetera.
Great.
One thing that I've discovered recently is that when you're working on a show that's for streaming only, I have not seen that there are strict loudness standards for situations like that for some reason. Not quite sure why that is, but that seems to be the case for streaming shows. Shows that are never going to be on a regular broadcast network.
Right. Great. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
So the next question. We'll wait for it to come up. So it said music is an important part of. I mean, we already sort of. I think you already touched upon this mostly. But
I'm happy to touch it again if we need to.
Just a clarification. It says music is an important part of sound design. At what point in the sound design development do you introduce music? What is the relationship with music and composers? Which I think for the most part you already answered, but yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, my opinion is as early as possible. I like working with composers before they've actually started composing and before I've actually started sound designing. And I think that in this day and age, as the two disciplines become closer and closer together in terms of the overlaps that happen, I think that there are a lot of good examples of musical sound design, sound design that has musical elements to it, pads that have tonality to them, not necessarily anything that's going to play a melody, for instance, but things that are musical in nature, rhythmic things that are, really percussion, but with sound effects, The lines have been more blurred than ever, and they continue to get more blurred, I think, between what music is and what sound design is. And so I think it's then even more important that composers and sound designers collaborate early on, as both disciplines might be considering things that might have previously been considered part of the other's domain. Does that make sense?
Completely.
Yeah, I mean, I've created a lot of stingers and risers as a sound designer that I use in my work. And those are things that will definitely cross over into the music realm at times. And if a composer decides to put a huge percussive bang at a moment where there's definitely going to be a sound design element there as well, then that's an area where collaboration could help avoid a train wreck at the mix.
Right. Makes sense.
So to speak. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, we got another question here. And again, it's something that we sort of already talked about, but just, to make sure people are clear on it. And it's kind of going back to at what point in the process do you kind of create the space, the sound space do you add the sound space to the dialogue and the ADR? I think specifically what they're trying to ask is, because you're talking about when you're recording ADR and Foley, you want it as clean as possible. So at what stage is that all sort of put into a sound room? Does that make sense?
Generally speaking, traditionally, that stage is the final mix. I mean, that's going to be the first place where those things are going to come together in a room and be balanced against each other. However, I would say that as a sound designer and supervisor that has worked on a lot of different project sizes, I've often combined those things early on before the mix, and so that I could, as a supervisor or designer, have some context to work within. Like I said early on in talking about technique, I don't recommend working in a vacuum all the time. Sorry about the dog barking. What that would mean would be to, when it's possible for yourself, whatever you're working on, go ahead and include the other disciplines as a reference for yourself. For instance, if you want to know, if you're working on dialogue and you want to know how that dialogue is going to work against the raging sounds of a storm or a a car chase or a gunfight, you might want to have those sounds, even if they're temp mock-ups or crash downs from your sound editor or sound designer. You might want to have those sounds to work against, to know what you're going to have to do in order to have the dialogue work in the mix. It's not a bad idea if you have the opportunity to create that context for yourself in your own editorial environment. Often if I'm working on sound design or sound effects, and I have the temp music track from the turnover and the dialogue track from the turnover, even though they're not finished editorially or final, I can use those things to work against. And so if part of your question is, when do you introduce an environment where you're putting those things together, as a reference, it's never too early. It's always a good idea to work with those things at hand. You don't necessarily want them on all the time, but when you're done with a little something, you might want to hear it against the dialogue and the music as a guide to you to see how they're working together.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. And sometimes in order to evaluate whether dialogue and ADR are ultimately going to work together, sometimes you need the help of what the real environment's going to sound like in the mix, because some of that stuff's going to hide what
the context.
Yeah. With all things playing, the ADR is going to end up working fine. Whereas if you're listening to it in a vacuum with just the clean dialogue, just the clean ADR, and not treated at all for the mix, it's not going to sound like it's going to work necessarily.
Right. That makes sense. Okay. So next question. Going back to when you were talking about kind of recording in live environments as it happens.
Mm-hmm.
I think the specific question is, what's the process to remove, if necessary, things like insects or stuff like that from production sound? On-set noise, basically, that you can't get rid of. And I guess the question is, before you have to go to ADR, like, how would you go about removing it as a first plan of attack?
Well, my process is, if I have the time myself, even though I'm not the most experienced isotope RX user, I can work my way through some stuff with it if I have to. I'll do an early experiment of noise removal to see how far I can go before I'm hearing the artifacts and the processing of that noise removal, because that's a fine art in and of itself nowadays, is what we call no noising. It's essentially noise removal from production dialogue. There are a lot of specialists out there that have gotten really, really good at using the tools available, mostly plugins these days, to remove sounds, not just filtering them out, filtering out a certain frequency across the board, but actually going in almost on a molecular level and carving out the undesirable sound, leaving the desirable sound, and it ends up sounding okay, depending on how far you have to go to carve that out. So my process, I'll give you an example of what I do on Dynasty on a fairly weekly basis, is I'll get the show and I'll make a pass through all of the dialogue using the editor's tracks, but also the assembly, so that I have all the original sound as well to check myself. And I will put together a note track for my dialogue editor, asking him if he can fix this or that. There's a clunk on this line. Can you get it out or find an alt? There's a lot of insects in this scene in general. I'm a little worried about it. Let me hear an edit and a light pass and a heavy pass of noise removal to see if it's going to work, or if I have to ADR the whole scene. So I'll put together these questions for my dialogue editor almost immediately. It's one of the first things I do, in addition to programming the ADR. And he'll usually get back to me within a day or so with little quick times put together of an example of his fix that I can review. And so I can make a determination at that point, oh, he was able to fix this. I don't have to ADR that line. the light noise removal pass of this insect scene sounds pretty good to me. I think that's going to work for my mixer. Maybe I'll send it along to him as well, just to make sure he's okay with it. Maybe I will go ahead and ADR a few lines that are borderline, that are spoken so quietly that once the noise has been removed, there's not a lot left of the line. And so I might want to ADR that, but I'm not going to want to ADR the entire scene in most cases. So that's my process, is that I'll have my dialogue editor noise removal guy, which is the same guy in a television show situation, go ahead and address all my concerns and sort of show me what it's going to sound like after he fixes it.
Great.
So that I can then make that determination as to whether or not I'm actually going to ADR a lot of a scene or a little of a scene or none of a scene.
Perfect. That makes sense.
Does that help? Does that answer?
Yeah, I think we have two more, if that's okay, or do you want to do one more? It's up to you.
We'll do however many more you want. That's fine.
I think we got two more.
Oh, wow, it's been 3 hours. Look at that.
Yeah. So I think, you kind of mentioned it in passing, and it's not really part of the post process, but, just to answer the question, somebody was asking, what is a music supervisor? I think that's just something that I mentioned. What is the role?
I didn't talk a lot about it because music supervisors are usually their own department entirely, and a music supervisor does basically what a sound supervisor does for the music department. There won't usually be a lot of interaction with a composer, especially a big name composer that's sort of doing his own thing. But the music supervisor's job, mostly practically, is to find source music and make sure that not only is it working for the scene, or that the filmmakers have some options to choose from, but that source music the rights can then be secured. Music supervisors will generally cover both of those things. And they will also work with the composer as well, because as the music supervisor, by definition, they've got their hands in that part of the process as well. They're looking at the music as a whole discipline, the score, the source, all of it together, and are working with the team to make all that stuff work together well. But mostly what the music supervisor does is find songs to work in the movie, either as source, for example, a song playing out of a jukebox in a diner very low where it's not featured, or a song that's actually featured either in the main title or in the end credits or in a montage. That would fall under the sound supervisor's domain as well.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. Thank you. And then the last one, which I think it's just a good one in general to kind of wrap it up, is if you have any kind of general tips or recommendations or advice for young sound designers or just people that are just kind of going into the business for the first time, going into sound design for the first time. Any kind of sage advice?
You know what? I think I may have forgotten to add a couple of books and websites to my PowerPoint now that I'm thinking of it, because I would recommend looking into a few books. Let me share another screen.
There, you might have skipped it. I think it's slide 29.
Oh, I did skip it. Look at that. Sorry. Some useful resources. Yeah. These books that I've listed are all really good, in my opinion, for entry-level folks to get a much more comprehensive idea, at least from the author's standpoint of what post-sound is all about. The David Sonachine book is pretty famous.
Yeah, I think they're gonna come up on
the Tomlinson-Hallman book is pretty famous. Tomlinson-Hallman is actually the TH in THX. The Audiovision book, Walter Murch was a contributor, and I would read anything that he wrote. I would look at any interview that he gave. He's a master at this craft. Practical Art of Motion Picture Sound by Udall. He's a current guy. The last book is good as well. They're all good books. The websites, asoundeffect.com is a current website that maintains a current blog and keeps, updates things. The filmsound.org is a website that's actually been archived. The last contribution to it, I think, was a couple of years ago. And there's a lot of stuff on it that's actually old, but it's really good. Even though some of it looks dated and old, it's a great resource. The filmsound.org. And then the designingsound.org is a blog that has been discontinued recently as well, but has been archived, and you can look through it all. And it's got some great interviews in it. It's got some great links for resources for what we do. I highly recommend checking it out. I mean, obviously, you can spend a few minutes Googling and find your way to a lot of different things, but this is where I would start as useful resources. If you're just getting started out, just from a practical standpoint, from a job standpoint, if you're able to get even an internship or a real low-level job at a studio that does mixing and sound editorial, do it, because it's probably the easiest way to get a shot at working in that environment, even though you won't get rich for a while. It might be the best way for you to get opportunities to get real life experiences. If you can get some sort of low-level position at a studio, you might be cleaning and making coffee and showing clients into studios for a while, but chances are you'll get a shot at some little project that'll come in, and you'll have plenty of people to learn from, because it is an apprenticeship craft. It is the type of thing that is best learned by doing alongside with people that know what they're doing.
That's great. Okay, well, I think that that should do it for the masterclass. Jay, thank you so much for all this great
information. My pleasure, man.
And for your time, and you really.
I hope I didn't bore too many of you to tears.
Not at all. No, we in the chat we have really a lot of really great comments. Thank you very much. Very good. It's overwhelming positivity on the chat. So it looks like
great.
You enjoyed
thank you.
So I really appreciate
Excellent.
you being with us. And if anybody.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
If anybody wants to look me up, my company is Sublime Sound. My website is sublimesound.tv. It's not a bad way to find me. I'm happy to field emails as well. Happy to share, answer questions, whatever. Happy to do it.
And same here. Yo también me pueden, si están interesados en el sonido, en las cosas, pues yo estoy disponible. Me pueden escribir a mí también, que yo estoy acá en Bogotá. Mi correo es andres@otbirds.com, de 1000 Birds, OTBirds, andres@otbirds.com. Me pueden escribir, y bueno, a la orden para lo que necesiten también. Siempre estamos buscando gente joven y nueva que le interese esto. Entonces, pues hasta acá estamos. Thank you very much, Jay. And thank you to Latin American Training Center and to Asocinde for having us. And yeah, until the next one.
It was a pleasure spending a few hours with you, man.
Perfect. Likewise. Yeah, once again.
Talk to you soon. All right.
Okay, great.
Take care, everybody.
You too. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Esto fue Bogotá Big Ideas Academy, un espacio de formación en el que, junto con expertos locales y extranjeros, buscamos generar contenido que aporte al crecimiento académico de emprendedores y empresarios. Estaremos hablando sobre emprendimiento, negocios, economía, inversión y mucho más. Siempre con el propósito de impulsar el talento que se proyecta al mundo desde Bogotá.